Okay teachers, what is the worst experience you have had with a student? Or, what is the worst thing you have seen a student do to a teacher? It's not any one student, usually. It's what one student, or more than one student does, and how that interfaces with other adults in the community, parents, administrators, etc. I guess I'll relate a few stories here that played into my decision to leave the profession. Point the accuser. This one isn't that dramatic. It happened shortly after I got to the school. Young male baby-faced teacher. Students who were interested in testing the new guy. I came in mid-year, so a young woman is talking to the student behind her while I'm trying to present, and it's getting distracting for me and everyone else. I've already warned her verbally a time or two. I need to pull her out in the hallway for a conference. Duh pet, come see me in the hallway. Duh pet. I'm not supposed to be alone in the hallway with a guy. Now, that sounds fairly innocuous, if a bit dim-witted, but the look on her face, combined with the way in which she said it, told me that she was setting me up, or trying to make me think she was setting me up. If I dragged her out in the hall, the implication was she could accuse me of inappropriate conduct. As a teacher, when you get accused of something like that, you might eventually beat the rap, but you rarely beat the ride. Front page of the papers, name drug through the mud, hearings, legal fees, etc. So I had two choices. Cave, and there's blood in the water. Press the issue and she might hang me out. To dry point I said, I'm not a guy. I'm your teacher. That's a public hallway, and we are going there, or I'll have the resource officer remove you. Out. In the hallway we went to discuss her behavior. As soon as the class period ended, I emailed my department chair, my principal, my vice principal, everyone I could think of, with the exact details of what happened. I called her parents as well, and luckily, they were good folks who knew their daughter, so I was safe. Point. But had they been total morons, as some parents are, things could have gotten ugly. Point. Lesson learned. Any kid can point a finger at you and endanger not only your job, but your potential for future gainful employment. This can happen at any time, and for no reason at all. Edit. I've wrestled with myself over whether to put this edit up, but I've had a lot of people ask me about a book and encourage me to write one. I thought it might be an effective way to get the word out to just leave this here. I'm not a teacher, but I witnessed it. During the 7th grade I had a biology teacher named Mr. Stark, yep, who was a really great funny guy. Everyone in class respected and liked him. He'd crack jokes about his wife being a horrible gorilla and just generally had a sarcastic, asshole sense of humor. In the middle of the year, he abruptly disappeared. I only gathered hearsay, but from what I heard around campus, he had a nervous breakdown and was fired. Of course, this was a campus of 12 to 14-year-olds, so we gotta take that with a grain of salt. A mousy older woman appeared as a long-term substitute after that. No one had ever had her as a sub before, and she was very frail and soft-spoken. For the rest of that year, the class terrorized her. No one ever did any work. During the class, kids would go into the storage closet, it was a lab classroom, and play with, break, the beakers and chemistry sets. There were fish tanks with algae and anemone ecosystem type things, and at one point, a kid knocked one over. People were loud and wild the entire class period, running around the classroom, literally jumping up on tables, and it was just impossible for her to teach, and for anyone to learn in that environment. We literally got nothing done that entire time. It was basically free time. Draw and listen to your CD player hour, because while I didn't want to add to the problem, she just didn't do lectures or assign homework. Not only that, but the kids teased her relentlessly. They made fun of her because she was balding, because she had a slight tremble, and would regularly tell her to shut the fuck up or call her a beach. It was heartbreaking. I guess one day she was reprimanded by the upper office staff because she started putting her fist down a little bit. But if she raised her voice, the class got louder. If she assigned home/class walk, only I and maybe 3 other people did it. One day she snapped. She started screaming. I mean literally screaming, not yelling but actually screaming, as if someone was killing her, and threw her lecture notes across the room. The class finally got quiet. All she did was sink down to the floor and start crying. I don't think anyone knew what to do. We just watched her sob for a few minutes before someone finally left to grab another teacher. The remainder of the class period was supervised by a security guard, and none of us spoke for the rest of the hour. None of us spoke about her. Even after she was replaced by a pet teacher, they figured they'd pull in someone we knew and respected, and the class went on. No one ever talked about her ever again. It was like everyone was ashamed about what we'd done to this poor innocent woman. If I were in her position, I would never teach again. TLDR. Middle schoolers can be absolute monsters. I'm not a teacher yet, but I've done a lot of classroom observations and the like for my preparation classes. This is by far the worst incident I've ever seen. I was observing a senior English course at the high school I had graduated from some 4 years prior. I loved my senior English teacher. She was absolutely a fantastic human being besides being a great teacher, and she was very happy to have me back in her classroom as an observer and a sometimes aide. I'd been observing in her class once a week for about 2 months at this point. Over time, I'd noticed the tension increasing between two girls in the class. When I started, they had seemed good friends. They always came into the classroom arm in arm and chatting. Every week I showed up, they seemed less friendly. Eventually they had taken seats at opposite ends of the classroom and had stopped speaking to one another entirely. I was sort of concerned about it, so I brought up the issue with the teacher. Have you noticed something going on between girl 1 and girl 2? I was told that yes, the teacher was aware of it, but because of what she had been told in confidence she didn't want to discuss it. I was completely fine with this and just wanted to make sure that someone knew what was going on. I come in the next week and one of the girls isn't there. She finally comes in something like 20 minutes late. As she walks past the other girl's desk to her seat, they absolutely glare daggers at one another. Some sort of pheromone cue must have gone off, because with no warning, the seated girl flies out of her seat, knocking her desk over, and goes after the girl who had come in late. The seated girl has her hands around the late girl's neck, and the teacher is trying to separate them. For a moment I just sit there with my mouth open. I'd never seen something like this happen in a classroom before. The girls are screaming at each other. Apparently they're fighting over a boy. They look like they are going to kill one another. The teacher, for the record, is a very powerful woman personality wise. However, she's in her 60s and is a fairly short spindly woman with very little physical strength. She's yelling at the girls to stop it and trying to push them apart. Before I can get up to help her, one of the girls shoves her. The teacher falls backwards and hits her head on a desk. She's now on the floor, holding her head in both hands. At this point I'm in full motion. I yell at the student to go to the office and tell them there's a medical emergency and a fight in the classroom. The kid takes off out the door. I manage to get in between the girls, but they are still trying to get at one another around me. I'm quite a bit bigger than either of them, and I'm generally stronger than the average woman. I bear hug the girl in front of me and pick her up off the ground. I shove the girl behind me with my back, and she stumbles backwards. I don't know if she fell down or not, but it gave me time to get out of the room. I managed to get the door open and step outside with one of the girls still in a bear hug. The girl inside, at this time, has managed to catch up to me. She starts hammering on the door, screaming and cursing, and I have to brace my back against the door so that she can't get through. I try to look through the window next to the door to check on the teacher, but all I can see is the eyes, teeth, and flailing arms of the girl inside. After a moment, the school security comes around the corner at full tilt. It would have been humorous in any other situation, since the man is something like 400 pounds and 5 feet tall. He must have been huffing like a rhino. Almost the same time, a pair of cop cars swing into the parking lot adjacent to the classroom and 4 cops pile out. An ambulance arrives right behind them. The presence of the cops make the girl I've got in a bear hug panic. She's no longer trying to get at the girl in the classroom. She's trying to get me to let go of her. She manages to get a hand free, grabs a hunk of my hair, and rips it out of my head. I had a bald spot for a month. I let go of her, and she turns and runs directly into a police officer. He takes her to the ground and handcuffs her, and I step aside to let the other officers and the paramedics into the classroom. It takes 2 more cops to get the other girl cuffed and on the ground. Nobody, including the teacher, was seriously injured. It turned out that girl 1's boyfriend had been cheating on her with girl 2. Girl 1 had suspected, but didn't actually know for sure until the day before this incident, at which point her boyfriend spilled the beans and told her he was leaving her for girl 2. Both girls were expelled, and I'm told that the boyfriend came out of the closet soon after. This was more or less the final straw in my observations that made me decide to teach elementary grades instead of high school. Obviously not all high school students are like this, but I've seen more serious altercations for stupid reasons in high school than I have in a second grade classroom. I'd rather deal with Billy took my red crayon, so I'm excluding him from kickball, than Susan stole my boyfriend, so I'm going to kill her. TLDR. 2 high school girls in a class I'm observing try to kill one another over a boyfriend dispute, injuring the teacher in the process. School security, town police, and an ambulance become involved, but nobody is seriously hurt. Both girls get expelled. I decide I don't want to teach high school. The boy turns out to be gay. My mom used to teach 3rd grade. One year she had a student with some sort of special needs that required him to have a personal minder/assistant/ whatever you call it come to class with him to help him out. One day, for whatever reason, this kid goes completely batshit, picks up his desk, and smashes his minder/assistant person in the head with it. This lady is now unconscious and bleeding on the floor, and the kid is running like hell off campus into the adjoining neighborhood. At this point my mom has to either A. leave 30 other kids unsupervised along with one adult who is out cold and bleeding from a head wound to chase this little faker, or B. allow a 9-year-old with special needs to disappear into the sunset. She decided to stay with her class and called the office for help. Fortunately, the police found the kid who had run off before anything could happen to him. Paramedics came and took the injured woman to the hospital. I thought my mom handled things pretty well. The parents of the student who caused the problem did not. In fact, they filed a civil suit against my mom for endangering their precious little boy. Of course, the school administration did nothing to back her up. Fortunately, she managed to keep her job and not get faked over in court, but it was close. Point edit. For clarification, it was one of those desks that are just hollow metal tubes with a plastic seat and a plywood writing table bolted on. I wasn't there, but my understanding is that the kid grabbed and slid/swung it at the seated quadrangular till the kid did not lift it above his head, Hulk smash style. Also, I think this kid may have been a bit older than the normal 3rd graders, but I'm not sure. The kid's dad was an attorney, and I think that he filed suit just because he was pissed and wanted the whole thing to be someone else's fault. I don't know the details, but I think the case got tossed because he was a douche and full of shit. However, the total lack of support from the school was a creepy indicator of what could have been. My first semester of student teaching. This was at a fairly rural regional high school. I was teaching freshmen, 9th grade, European history. The assignment was a short research-based essay, 3 to 5 pages, on a European leader we had studied, as well as a short presentation, PowerPoint or good old-fashioned poster board and glue, on the individual point the day the presentations are due. One of the students is missing. I don't think anything of it, because she's a fairly consistent, slightly above average student. She was scheduled to present on that day, but we'd spaced presentations out over 3 days, so I figure I'll have her present when she comes in tomorrow. Point the next day, she comes into class with no presentation in hand. I take her aside before class begins and ask why she doesn't have it. She tells me she'd prepared a poster board and asked her mother to bring it in that morning since she didn't want to ruin it on the bus. She asks if I saw her mother or anyone with her poster. I say no, and remind her that it's ultimately her own responsibility to provide the presentation. I give her the benefit of the doubt with the story, and since she had an excused absence due to an illness the previous day, she has an extra day to get the assignment in anyway. Final day of presentations. She comes in, tearing up. I immediately ask what the problem is. She says that her mom got into a car accident on the way to school, and that doing x-rays at the hospital, they discovered she has cancer. I immediately ask if she's okay, if there's anything I can do, if she wants to speak the school resource counselor, etc. I give her a pass down to the guidance office, to speak with her counselor and tell her not to worry about the project. Just as an aside, it's always been my philosophy that some things in life are more important than school, and family is one of them. I think this stems from the fact that my father died of cancer when I was 12 in the 7th grade, and I missed a few weeks of school. Upon my return, I got some of the best teacher support. Many classmates had prepared sympathy cards, and I got a lot of help from the school guidance department to make up my missed work. I believe school is important, but life is short, and there are some things that should definitely come first. Well, it turns out that in this case, the student's mother didn't have cancer. It was all a lie to get out of turning in the project late without a consequence. I suppose the student didn't consider the emotional consequences of lying about cancer, but having read David Elkind's work on egocentrism, I knew that it was more due to adolescence than maliciousness. She was asked to apologize, which she did half-heartedly. I found out later that her parents had recently gone through a divorce, and she was going through a lot of tough stuff at home herself. This made me really think, going forward, about each student as an individual. The sheet they go through, the challenges they face, they'll all be different. To be an effective teacher, we really have to know our students and give them structure and guidance through tough times, personally and academically. So, I suppose more than a worst experience, not that it didn't anger me, I see this and each bad incident I've had with students as a learning experience. There's a lesson, a teachable moment, in bad behavior, for the student, and more often than not, for the teacher. TLDR, student lied to me about mother getting cancer. Didn't know I lost a parent to cancer. Learned from the experience. Edit, added more detail, and cleaned up some wording. Edit 2, wow, thanks for all the great responses. I really appreciate everyone's positive and constructive feedback. I'm just one teacher trying to make a difference. I'm sure there are many in your school communities trying to do the same. I hope that you've had, or your sons/daughters, had the benefit of a teacher who guided and helped them gain knowledge and social capital. Most of us really do care. Also, cleaned up some wording. Thanks to Mamiha for pointing that out. I was subbing in an elective class. The kids at this school did not take electives seriously as they could flunk them, but pass on to the next year. The class of students came in with the attitude of let's play with the sub. Usually I can handle this with the age-old game of names on the board for the teacher to see the next day. These kids didn't care. One girl got up and wrote her own name on the board. As I was passing back some work that needed to be reviewed, a girl, call her Lisa, said, "Hey, you hit me." I had grazed my hand across the Lisa's arm as I put the paper on her desk. Lisa quickly said who saw her hit me, and all the kids raised their hand. Then Lisa went into a speech about how last year they got a teacher fired by saying the teacher had touched them. Another girl, call her Buffy, chirps in with how the teacher was completely shocked when Buffy also testified the teacher had touched her. Buffy said the teacher was shocked that Buffy would lie about the teacher as the teacher used to give up her lunch to tutor Buffy. Lisa said, "Yeah, the funny thing is we lied. I told Lisa to please go to the office right now and file an incident report about me hitting her." Lisa said sure and walked out. I was having an anxiety attack, but kept it together. At the end of my day, I went to the office and asked if Lisa had filled a report. The secretary said no, she didn't, and when the secretary asked why she was there, Lisa said the sub said to go to the office. The secretary had just left Lisa there till the period ended, then asked the girl to leave. I wrote a report about what the kids had said about getting a teacher fired the year before. As I wrote it, I told the secretary about the incident. The secretary said the teacher had not been fired, but moved to another school. That was the last time I accepted a sub job at that school. Not me, but my mom. This happened when I was in kindergarten or first grade, 5 or 6 years old. At this point my mother was teaching 9th grade algebra in the same school district I attended. I would go to work with her every morning, then transfer via school bus from her school to my school. Once the buses started running. One morning, as I was getting on the bus and the older students that were going to my mom's school were getting off the bus, a girl looks at me, grins and says, "You're Mrs. Chain Jean's mum's kid, right?" To which I reply, "Golly gee lady, I sure am," or something along those lines. thinking she is going to tell me how great my dear old mom is, and how much she enjoys learning about variables and everything else from her. Yeah, well tell your mom she's a real beach, okay? Point my 5 or 6-year-old self didn't know the word beach. I'm sure I'd heard it, but I didn't know that it had a negative connotation when used towards people, much less that it was considered a bad word. So that night I'm at home, and my mom and dad are in the other room discussing their days, when I remember I have a message to deliver to my mother. I scurry into the other room, and, beaming, proclaim, Mom, I talked to one of your students today, and she says you're a real beach. My parents, shocked, look at each other, realize I have no idea what I've just said, and then burst into laughter. The next morning, my mom goes out to the bus area with me and asks me to point out the girl I had spoken with the day before. So I'm standing there eagerly awaiting this girl's arrival, thinking my mom is going to, I don't know, thank her or some such thing. Very proud of myself for successfully delivering the message. Once the bus pulls up, I dutifully point out the perpetrator and hop on the bus with a huge sense of accomplishment. I don't remember what happened to that chick as a result of all of this, but I do know that she is now a teacher in my hometown. Laugh out loud. TLDR, a freshman girl made my child self call my teacher mother a beach. Edit. I don't know that this is the worst experience my mom had, just a not so good one that pertains to me. Okay, you all are scaring me. I'm gonna be a teacher in a few years, and I guess it's good to at least be prepared for this stuff. Greater than sign. That being said, the meanest thing I've ever witnessed a student saying to a teacher was between a girl and my high school band teacher. She was one of those girls who just didn't really care about band, was taking it to get an easy A, etc. She had her phone out texting earlier that day, and since it was just one of her many texting infractions, my band teacher took her phone and said she could get it back the next day, or if her parents came and picked it up after school. She came into the classroom after school, where myself and a friend were getting help with our solo and ensemble pieces. She demanded her phone back, and when my teacher said that what he said earlier was going to stand, she started whining about how she had to drive to such and such a place and needed her phone that night. A fair point, but she was being a demanding asshole about it. He said, you can get your phone back tonight if one of your parents comes in and gets it. I'll be here all evening. And she just exploded. Yeah, well, I hope the next time you need to geo somewhere, you lose your phone and get in an accident and can't call for help and die. I hope you die. And then she dramatically stormed out. I was speechless and felt so bad for my teacher. Edit. This was several years ago when I was a lot more emotionally vulnerable. To the few people implying I'm too soft or weak to be a teacher, go shove it. From my 10th grade perspective, it was a horrifying and mean thing to hear, even if it was directed at someone else. Now, I think I'd just laugh if someone said that to me. I also agree with the people saying it was wrong of my teacher to confiscate her property. I do agree that the phone should have been given back after school, but understand that my teacher was the sort of guy who would listen to reason. If she'd explained her situation nicely and apologized for texting during class, she would have definitely got her phone back. But this girl was never really one to do things the mature way. Her entire existence was defined by how much she could bully the people around her, even her friends, and I respect my former teacher for not caving to that. TLDR, woodshop teacher goes through hell every day for the entire school year. People pissed in his office and fought with him, etc. Not a teacher, but a student in a class. That was absolute hell for a teacher. Well, at least the worst I've seen. It was a woodshop class in high school. The teacher had no control, and I mean no control, over 5 of his 6 classes. This occurred about 3 years ago. In my class. These things happened in the other 5 classes as well, but these are all stories from my class. He was cussed out daily. His computer was broken. His mouse and keyboard wires were cut. People wrestled with him. 2 huge gallons of Elmer glue were dumped in his office. People pissed in his office. People pissed upstairs. People pissed in the woodroom and the supply room. People broke machines. People threw hammers through windows and also across the room for fun. One time it hit the light and a mentally challenged kid sat below it. Luckily he was not hurt. People flooded the sink daily. People used fire extinguishers in his office, etc. So many stories. It was crazy every single day. It was absolutely insane. It was a small school, 1200-ish kids, and the school cold stopped it. It was a very nice neighborhood. We had a school cop who didn't do shit and cold at least checked in on him once in a while. The high school is in America's top 5%. They knew this was going on. How do I know they knew this was going on? They, school cop and some other guy, came in and told us to stop several times and they witnessed it before also. A teacher next to our class complained for the poor guy because she could hear the chaos every day. They cold helped, but they ignored it because they wanted to fire him so they could make it a room for an engineer class next year. The reason this all happened was because he was the nicest guy in the faking world. He didn't want to call the cops because he didn't want to see the kid's 18-year-old get in trouble or see people not graduate. He would order these people pizza after being faking insane all day, and then they would be insane after the pizza was gone. He was also a veteran. He was a medic in Vietnam. He would dive onto the floor every time something was thrown that would make a bang because of shell shock. He lost his wife and son to a divorce after he was scammed trying to buy a house for her and their son. The only thing left in this guy's life was his woodshop class. He loved it more than anything, but these batch of kids ruined it for him. I don't know what happened to him. He told me he was going to try to find another job at a trade school. 2 stories. I hope they don't work against each other. I teach at an inner city school. Not the toughest school, but rough enough. My first year there, I noticed an older teacher down the hall in the industrial tech department. Maybe mid-50s. Very sad looking, a shrinking violet, but friendly. About a month into my job, I asked about him because I noticed a group of large senior students had said something to him in the hallway that made the students laugh, but caused him to shrivel and walk away. I wanted to intervene, but afraid that without knowing the context I'd just embarrass the teacher. Turns out that a few years ago, his son had died in a car accident. A few months after that, his wife died of cancer. That was the only family he had left. Understandably, since then, he lost whatever will he had left to fight for anything. Then, the year before my arrival, it all culminated in him being shoved in a large cabinet in the metal shop and locked in. It took about 45 minutes to get him out. In my 9 years in the teaching profession, it's the saddest thing I've heard happen to a colleague too. This is for those of you saying you were on the fence about teaching until you read this thread. I entered teaching in 1995 and became a very popular teacher at my school. I loved teaching. Then, in 1999, I started having dreams of another career, stand-up comedy. My students even began encouraging me to pursue my dreams as I had done for them. And, to be frank, the marking load and stress of teaching was becoming too much for the money I was making. So, in 2000, I threw my hat into the comedy ring. I did well. By 2002, I was making just enough to quit teaching. By 2008, I had a daily local show on TV and on my way to making my mark in my second career. Then, something strange started happening. I was waking up feeling empty. Making people laugh and taping a daily television show was thrilling, but like any high, lasted only so long. It started wearing off quicker. I had to assess what was going on, and with my girlfriend's help, realized what it was. I missed teaching. I missed having young people gathered around my desk at lunch and after school talking about their struggles and dreams and turning to me to help guide them. I missed having the challenge of a reluctant learner in my classroom, staring at me with those vacant eyes, and after 5 or 6 months of having our wills battle it out, seeing his eyes enlarge right at that aha moment when he finally gets it. I missed turning around a young person's life. I tell you, I've had about 2,000 people in a theater in Northern California stand in unison to applaud a killer set of jokes I'd managed to string together, setting my heart racing and my ego soaring. That is nothing compared to the feeling of having a knock at your classroom door one day after school, seeing a familiar yet older face, telling you what you did for him years ago and how he owes his new career and life to your dedication and faith in him. This has only happened a couple of times, but it feels like winning a lottery. You only need to win a couple to feel like the luckiest guy in the world. So, 2 years ago, I went back to teaching with a renewed vigor, insight, and passion. And, at the risk of sounding immodest, as, admittedly, I've been doing this whole post, I've been an awesome teacher. It helps that I still do my other job on weekends to keep my interests in balance. And this isn't to say that I won't burn out again, but right now, returning to teaching and nurturing the potential in young adults is one of the best decisions I've made. I write this for one purpose: we need excellent teachers. Kids have become inured to the fact that a lot of their teachers are gonna suck, that school is a chore, and that life is a boring play of many parts which every single person is resigned to play. There are several of you who have written of a desire to teach mixed with a fear of it. From someone who has been burned out by it and rewarded through it, I ask you to rethink abandoning this noble profession. Yes, it'll burn you out. Yes, it will cause days and nights of self-examination. And, yes, it will make you constantly wish you were in other places. But if you know your subject, love your students, and have a few teaching tools at your disposal, there is no profession that is more ennobling, fulfilling, and, yes, joyful than teaching. Just think about it. I've had students threaten me nearly every week. The school I taught at was real dangerous minds like. For me though, was this student who had severe depression, paranoid schizophrenia, and substance abuse issues. I'll call him Steven. Steven was one of my very first students I ever had as a teacher. I really just fell into the teaching profession. I had never wanted to be a teacher in my entire life, but life had been preparing me to become a teacher without me knowing. I came into the school year at the beginning of the second semester with bright plans and ideas to freshen up the class, retention English and social studies. I knew a bit about my population, the kids that fell through the cracks, didn't pass the courses the first 2 times around, came from juvenile justice, etc. The students' previous experience with their teacher was awful. She would put them down. She wasn't culturally competent, would say derogatory words about their families, everything. She apparently also liked to emotionally beat up Steven. Steven and I had something in common. We both loved to learn for fighters. I noticed his FF tattoo on his arm, and I told him how I own nearly every album that Dave Grohl has put out. He made a sheepish grin towards me and showed me some artwork he had made in his sketchpad along with lyrics he had been writing to make his own songs. The year began to progress really well with Steven. His grades began to improve. He put on some weight. He began to journal lively about his home life, which was awful, but journaling his life became his output, and he even began to become more respectful towards others. I was really becoming proud of the man that Steven was becoming. I never really liked to take time off, but I had to for training. All teachers hate this crap at our district offices. The substitute I had was the sister of their former teacher. I should have known something was going to happen. I found out in the afternoon that Steven had a complete meltdown after the substitute berated him for his look. She'd hit the fan when the substitute pulled headphones off of Steven. She didn't read my substitute binder that I left with instructions. I had a bin of headphones for the students to use with their names on them. Steven became irate, but tried to cool down. He went immediately for his journal and the substitute took away his ballpoint pen. He got it back and stabbed himself in the neck with it, breaking the skin. Steven had to be transported to the hospital and to the state school. This substitute became a teacher at the school. I never forgave her for what she did. She claims she was assaulted, even though cameras were placed in my classroom. I always wonder what happened to Steven. I hope he overcame his mental illnesses. He and I also loved Poe and Hemingway. Every time I read either of those writers, he pops into my mind. I went to a public exam school. It was the best of the best where the students worked hard, excelled, went to great colleges, blah, blah, blah. While I don't deny that the school was a great place to learn, I can't help but feel that the perceptions everyone has of the school and its students are completely romanticized. There were a lot of hard-working students, but the majority of them, in my opinion, should have been kicked out a long time ago. Many of them just did not give a shit and you could just see the defeat in the teacher's eyes when dealing with students who didn't want to learn, but still expected a good/passing grade. There wasn't much that the teachers could do, except give the lowest possible passing grade. As the administration put a lot of pressure on the teachers to pass students. And the students knew that. If a teacher even thought about failing a kid, he would rope their parents in, and the school would side with the kid. The logic was, if this kid got into the school, he must be smart. If they're failing, then it must be the teacher, not them. One example that stands out the most was 10th grade French class. I had the most amazing teacher. She was this tiny little woman who knew so much and had so much to offer, but everyone just threw it back into her face. Now, the school went from grade 7th to 12th, and starting in 8th grade, you had to take a foreign language for 4 years. No one in my class, except for a handful, knew shit. Seriously. The most basic verbs, avoir, être, faire, regular verbs, couldn't be conjugated in the present tense. We spent a good chunk of the year going over what people should have learned 2 years ago. But since this was a third year class, we obviously had to learn new things. My teacher had us read awesome things, asterix, guide more passant, and would even make a vocab list for us. All we had to do was look up the words and she would explain to us the etymology, which, for a geek like me, was super fun. Easy, right? Less than half the class would do it. Most would be sleeping during lessons, and, as a result, fail her ridiculously doable tests. And she wasn't a new teacher, she had been teaching for 30 years, and knew her stuff. As I said, the kids in danger of failing her class would drag in their parents, so that everyone could have a talk which consisted of the parents blaming her for everything their child wouldn't do. And of course you know whose side the school supported. What pained me the most was seeing her come in, eager to start teaching and willing to start on a new slate, only to be pissed and unmotivated 45 minutes later. So fuck those kids. I'm so grateful I had her that year, and wish that I had her as my teacher for all the years that I took French. I still have her notes, and like to go through them from time to time. I'm not a teacher, but as a student, I made it a point to stand up for a good teacher I had when they were accused by 2 of my fellow students of failing them without cause. Mrs. Johnson was a first year biology teacher and was really innovative in comparison to our other teachers. She would assign us homework that involved actually going out and discovering the world around us, instead of simply reading chapter 12.2 of the students in class with me had parents who were powerful in our small town. One was the principal of the elementary school. The other was a prominent farmer. I told you it was a small town. They were both athletes, both dumber than a box of rocks, and both knew that they didn't have to really try, because mommy and daddy were always there to step in and make sure that everything was copacetic. Well, midterms came around, and they both ended up deficient, grade-wise, which meant that they couldn't play for the men's and women's basketball teams until they got their sheet together. The sticking point was a large assignment that they hadn't even bothered to do. I don't remember the specifics, but it involved finding articles in the newspaper relating to biology and doing research on that topic, or something like that. Of course, their parents threw a fit and got a school board meeting called. Our teacher was terrified. I was sick of seeing these kids get their way and sick of seeing good young teachers chased out of our school district by overzealous parents and their shitty kids. So I decided to show up to the school board meeting on behalf of Mrs. Johnson. I stuck around school the day of the meeting and hit the weight room to keep myself occupied. Unfortunately, I lost track of time and ended up having to run from one end of the school to the other, still in my workout gear, in order to get to the meeting on time. I showed up to a room full of school board members, the principal, the superintendent, the teacher, and the kids and their parents. Then there was me, sweaty, wearing a torn up t-shirt and gym shorts. I wasn't off to the best of starts. I sat down, and the meeting started. The parents made their case, the teacher made hers, and the school board opened up the floor. I stood up. I had been sitting right behind the kids and their folks, so they all turned around and gave me the stink eye while I laid out, in detail, why they deserved to be failing the class. When I finished, one of the fathers asked me, "Well, did you do the assignment?" Because one of their contentions was that it was unnecessarily difficult. I admitted that, no, I didn't. But I had actually done all of the other work assigned to me, unlike their child, so I wasn't failing the class. I also kicked a barb about being man enough to admit that it was my fault for not completing the assignment, and not the teacher's. That sent the father over the edge, and he stood up to get in my face. The only problem was, he was about half a foot shorter than me. I'm only 6 feet tall. Then he called me a liar and asked me if I wanted to settle this outside. No kidding. I was so stunned that I didn't know what to say. Thankfully, the principal started laughing, told him to sit down before he got beat up by a student, and thanked me for speaking on behalf of Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson ended up keeping her job. The school board found in favor of her. The students had to sit out from sports until they got their grades back up to snuff, and things went back to normal. The next day after class, Mrs. Johnson asked me to stay after the bell and thanked me for standing up for her. 13 years later, that is still one of the proudest moments of my life. TLDR, as a student, I stood up for a teacher who was being railroaded out of a job for no good reason. I do part-time teaching at a community college, specifically in computer art. For 7 years I had very few problems with students. A few semesters ago I get a student, derp, in an intro to computer art class. He does okay in the class, and winds up with a C as he wasn't really getting it. This should have prevented him from moving on and hopefully would have spurred him to change his major to something else he could handle. I'm glossing over a lot of conversations we had about this. Move forward to last semester. Teaching a level 1 class in 3D modeling, and who shows up but derp. I'm already getting a bit worried about how I'm going to teach the 17 students, as in the intro class derp took up a disproportionate amount of time and this subject is miles more difficult. So we struggle through the first few weeks and turn in our first projects. His is weak but not terrible, as I feared. I give critiques and we move on. Second project time rolls around, and he turns in nothing. I speak with him and tell him that he needs something by Monday. We had Monday/Wednesday classes, or it would be a failure. Monday rolls around, and he's got nothing. A few other students told me they tried to help him to no avail. Okay, I'm fine with giving him an F and talking to him about withdrawing from the class, as it only gets harder from here. But by the end of class, he tells me he has put his assignment up on the server. So I copy it to my key drive and go home. Next class, he's literally bouncing out of his seat about his grade. I tell the whole class I didn't have time to review them yet, but I promise, this weekend I will get to them. Derp seems a bit dejected, but we move on with the lesson. I review the assignments over the weekend and I get to Derp's. The other assignments are mostly average, with 1 or 2 students submitting really nice models. Derp's model, however, is pretty damn amazing. So, of course, red flags start flying. I look at the source code of the file, which is in plain text for just this reason, and I can see that the last time the file was modified was months earlier, and that the path it was created in was from another student's name. So I email a few other professors that teach the same class one of the rendered images, and in 5 minutes I find out that, yup, this is another student's project. Derp went onto the network share and just took another student's project and submitted it. After a flurry of emails and phone calls to the dean, my coordinator and his advisor, it is determined I need to fill out an academic integrity violation form and withdraw him from the class. It could have been much worse, but why ruin his future over one bad decision? I get everything in order and resolve to talk to him the next class. I'm also to tell him that after we talk, he has to meet with his advisor, so it's about 30 minutes before the start of class and Derp comes in and immediately asks if I graded the assignments. About that, we need to talk, let's go outside. I take him to a secluded area and ask where he got the assignment. He stammers for a few seconds and I inform him that I know it's another student's work and that because of this, he is out of the class. That I had to report it to the school or I would lose my job, how this is the best of a bad situation for him, etc. The whole time he is getting really angry, and I think he is going to hit me, but thankfully that never happened, and I was doing really well at being very calm about it. Until he said it. The one thing that about out the Louis the 100th K in me, I wish you would have talked to me before you reported me. I just stared at him in shock, gathered myself and replied, I wish you would have talked to me before you decided to cheat, and then I had to walk away before I did something bad. TLDR. College student steals and submits assignment light years better than anything he can do, is caught and has the nerve to say I wish you would have talked to me before you reported me for cheating. Point edit. Formatting as a beach. There are situations that are the worst when it comes to routine bullshit. You know exactly how it's going to play out, but have to go through the motions in order to cover your ass. For instance, meeting with parents over their precious snowflake's misbehavior. I can absolutely guarantee that if the mother cries, the whole meeting is useless. When mums cry, it's because they don't know what to do either, won't admit that their child is an asshole, can't realize that they are enabling their own child's behavior through a lack of discipline, and are probably subconsciously trying to buy their child's affection by trying to be a friend rather than a parent. That said, the worst thing that's happened so far, I'm only in my second year of teaching, is this. One of my advanced students, a 9th grade girl, started the year full of energy and enthusiasm. Gradually, I noticed that she was getting quieter and quieter. She stopped turning in work. We are getting to the end of the semester, and I'm after her about a paper she hasn't turned in. Finally, I keep her after class and ask her if there's something going on at home. She tells me how everyone she knows has either died or gone over the last 5 years. Her dad's unemployed in another state. She's crying, no sound, just a slow leak of tears down her cheeks. I acknowledge that her situation sucks. Then she says, if I tell you something, you have to promise you won't tell anyone. I feel my blood run out of my face and freeze in my stomach. Oh, honey, I say, I can't promise that. If you're being hurt, planning to hurt yourself or someone else, I have to tell. She nods, then looks sideways at me. I think my stepdad likes me. And he kissed me. I blow out a whiff of air. That's one of the things I have to tell. But listen, whatever happens, you are right to tell me. Whatever happens is not your fault. It's his fault for doing this. You have the right to live in a home that's safe. She nods, leaves the room. I immediately go down to the guidance office and report our conversation. I spend the next 48 hours agonizing over the potential consequences for this kid and thanking the law that left me no choice in the matter, and having nightmares about what could have happened if she hadn't said anything. She turns up in class, this time with her head up and a smile on her face. I keep her back after the bell. Hey, you don't have to tell me if you don't think it's my business, but are you okay? She nods. The police came the same day I told you and took him away. How do you feel? Better? Oh, thank God. Good to know. You did the right thing. Go catch the bus. I know teachers who have been teaching for 35 years who have never had this situation come up. It's like winning a really shitty lottery. TLDR. Parent meetings suck, but not as much as a kid telling you she's being molested by her stepdad. Writing out scenarios is very difficult because if you care about your kids, you have to relive it every time you document something, and that hurts. So I appreciate all those here who took the time to do that and wish you some relief. I know it wasn't easy and that you likely had a few hours after of some tension. Please treat yourselves well. That is vital, and you know it. Harder kids have been my focus. So I have seen all manner of poor behavior from kids and some from parents. I've been threatened a few times. Had my car damaged. The cure for that is to drive beaters and don't wash them. However, only once has my house been attacked with an egg. In classes some of the most outrageous things have happened. However, I have always been able to find a way to get over it, reach out, and make headway. The primary thing that has made me want to quit has nothing to do with student behaviors. They are immature and the law acknowledges that. They are going to do things they regret. It's called learning. So I can understand and forgive. What makes most teachers and myself want to quit is the lack of support or outright attacks, both personal and professional, by adults who have not done their homework. There are far more teachers who want to help kids than there are news making fuck-ups, but all teachers get treated as fuck-ups if they ever hold ground for a kid when it doesn't suit some adults' agendas. Students First alone has bashed older teachers so irrationally that they've become more of a hate group than anything to do with students. I get the emails. They're very good at putting themselves first. I'm lucky and get left alone, largely because I let others take credit for what I do, and I prefer to do the hardest work for free. The union dislikes that, but lets me be because, gasp, they care about kids first too. And they are my only defense whenever changing admin becomes thuggish as many are wont to do. I don't talk to the press and I don't watch happy teacher movies, where the real life counterparts of cool teachers quit after fewer years than it takes to become good. There are no miracles, just hard work, and I don't relive incidents for anything but official documentation point, so I won't be telling any stories here of that ilk. However, there are teachers working, and natural born who will read this, and get dismayed at what pursuing their drives will bring. To them I say forge on, and go rogue, if you have to, and be a honey badger in your head. You can exist in a corrupt and inept and stupidly slow system, and make a difference for kids who need it desperately. You may never be able to see it, but you will be able to see yourself in the mirror, and be satisfied that you have done your best, not for pay, not for glory, but because it was the right thing to do. Just don't look at your car or your belongings too closely. I apologize that I have gone a bit off topic. It has been a long hard week with hours of documentation. From my days as a substitute teacher, I was assigned to a school that I had been to several times before. I walked into the principal's office, asked what class I'd be covering, and proceeded to engage in small talk. She begins with, "I'm giving you warning about Amanda. She's an extreme problem child and we're in the process of getting her transferred to a resource school. She normally doesn't make it through the first hour before having to be sent out of class, so don't be afraid to throw her out at the first sign of trouble. The tar will be able to point her out to you." So I go on my merry way. I get into class and the tar walks in, about 5 feet 5 inches, and a body that most supermodels would die for. I thought of it as a bit odd that she came in looking like she just walked out of a nightclub, but her attire wasn't my problem. Damn, this is gonna be a good day, I thought. Wrong. The students all piled in about a minute later and started taking their seats. As I go to walk over to the tar to ask who Amanda was, I notice that she is going to sit down as well. The tar wasn't a tar. It was Amanda. She was 15 years old, with the body of a 20-year-old, and in 7th grade, after having stayed back a couple of times because of her discipline issues. So now here I'm with an overdeveloped, underdressed 15-year-old in a class full of 13-year-olds who can't keep their eyes off her. I was 21, and I was having a hard time doing that. I found out later that the tar had also called out. The principal just hadn't been informed yet, after refusing to get rid of her gum, ignoring me, and then eventually telling me to go fuck myself. When I asked her to do her work, I sent her to the principal's office. Class resumed as normal until gym time. While the kids were gone, I went to the principal's office to fill out a report of what happened. We joked about it. She said she wasn't surprised, but asked if I would give her one more chance. She's got a field trip coming up that she really wants to go on, and she told her that one more incident would mean the loss of the field trip. Fine, I said, knowing that this likely wouldn't last long. So a few minutes later, the kids all file back in from gym class, all but Amanda. Expecting her to just straggle in a few minutes late to test me, I peeked out into the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. I asked the kids where she was. The principal's office, they told me. So much for that field trip. She didn't even last the 30 minutes of gym class, so I go about the rest of my day until lunchtime a couple of hours later. During lunch, I head back to the principal's office to see if I can find out what happened. When I walk in there, I see the principal in full FASAPM mode, shaking her head. "What happened?" I ask. "You're not going to believe this. While you and I were talking before, Amanda managed to sneak out of gym class. Apparently, she saw one of her friends in the hallway. When the gym teacher noticed she was gone, he went to go look for her. He heard noise coming from the boys' bathroom, and when he went in, he found Amanda doing things to a 6th grade boy that no 7th grade girl should know how to do." That was exactly how it was explained to me. I wasn't told, and quite frankly, didn't really want to know exactly what happened, but the way the principal went on, it sounded like she was giving him oral sex. So the principal calls both sets of parents. The boys' parents came in, heard what happened, and took the boy home to serve an indefinite suspension until a hearing was held regarding his future at the school. Amanda's mom comes storming in, demanding an explanation about why she was just pulled out of work again for stupid shit like this. The principal explained to her what had happened. So, the mom said, "What? Do you mean so?" The principal said, "Do you not understand what your daughter was caught doing? Yeah. They were fooling around. So what? What do you think they are gonna do when they get home? I can't believe that you pulled me out of work again for this. They're kids. They fool around. Get over it." And then she left, pissed. Amanda walked out smiling. Amanda was given indefinite suspension until the paperwork for her transfer went through. I don't know what happened to her after that. Student to teacher. Here I was at R4, my favorite teacher during my senior year, and he let me do my homework, read a book, or whatever I wanted to, as long as I had entered the grades in the computer and taken roll, among other things. It was a great setup. In another class, someone who sat with me was failing the class and asked me if I could help him out by boosting his grades for $20. I said no at first, but he badgered me so much saying his parents would kill him that I finally relented. Over the next month or two, I raised his grades up assignment by assignment so that he went from a C to a B+ in the class, all without attracting attention from Mr. Howard. I felt like crap for doing it, but I was young and dumb and kept doing it. After he got his semester report card and saw his grade, he was ecstatic and said he would pay me weeks past, and he never did. So I asked him when I would get my money. Finally he got mad and said he wouldn't pay me, so I said, "Fine, then I change your grades back." He said he would rat me out, and I believed him, so I decided to come forward and confess to Mr. Hoffman first. He was the coolest teacher ever, and as it hit me how much I betrayed him, I was crushed by my stupidity, but I did it anyway. I pulled him aside after school got out and confessed to him. I'll never forget his face when he said, "But I trusted you completely." It was awful. He said he would have to alert my parents, the parents of the kid, and have a conference with the administration. A few days went by, and he wouldn't let me do the grades anymore. I understood, but I also couldn't look him in the eye. I wondered why I hadn't heard from my folks about it, and I realized after a week that he hadn't notified anyone, nor did he. He confronted the kid, who confessed, and adjusted his grade. He also told the kid that, if his folks asked, he would have to explain the grade drop to his own parents. After 2 weeks, he gave me back the records and grading discs and told me to do what I did before and that he would be checking on my work. I thanked him and did my best work ever for the rest of the semester. Sadly, it changed our relationship and he never really trusted me again, but he knew I had messed up and that it took guts to confess. When I realized what he had done at the end of the year, I thanked him profusely and said to remember what happened and to really value trust and honesty. To this day, I hold both values very highly, and I know it shows. Mr. Hoffman was the man. I should look him up. Edit. Teacher's name. I'm not a teacher, but I used to work as a sort of counselor at a cadet summer camp. My job was basically to assume responsibility for about 30, 15-year-old kids at 6 in the morning and shepherd them through the day around an active military base. I was responsible for taking them to meals, classes, sports activities and back to their compound at night. The compound where all the cadets stayed housed about 500 kids at any one time in long trailers. Each trailer housed about 40 kids in rooms with 2 bunk beds each. There was a separate group of staff responsible for the compound, but there wasn't much to do there for the kids, and so needless to say it would take the entire armed forces to keep them from acting up. My particular group of kids were pretty good during the day. They would get rowdy during long classes and other activities, but considering we were expecting a group of teenagers to basically follow a military lifestyle for several weeks, they were fairly well behaved. Or so I thought. Kids would become different animals in that compound at night. Literally everything you could think of was an issue at some point or another. We had violent kids attack the staff and other cadets, kids defecate and urinate anywhere you can imagine. There was sexual and physical abuse galore. But the worst thing I had to deal with was easily one of the kids in my group, at night, ejaculating into another cadet's face while he slept. I don't really know what drives a person to do something like that. I guess a mixture of stupidity, adolescence, sexual experimentation and the rigors of such a rigid environment will drive a person to do some weird things. But man, that was really something. The only thing that made the job easier was that we basically had express consent from these kids' parents to subject the kids to discipline as per military guidelines. Having a kid hauled away by military police can be surprisingly refreshing. Anyway, always thought about doing an AMA about this. Any interest? I have horrible experiences almost daily. Here is an example of something very common that happened recently. Backstory: our administrators have requested that we do not give out any passes unless a kid is bleeding or puking. Basically, the nurse even comes to you, so the kids don't have to leave. The kids need to go to the bathroom between classes. This is basically to try to prevent fighting in the halls. Our hall passes are also a huge pain to fill out because they require tons of detail. This means lost teaching time, albeit only a couple of minutes, but our classes are only 45 minutes long. Every minute counts. I tell you this in an attempt to prevent the year a teacher on a power trip. Just let them pee comments, although I know I'll probably still get some points. So anyway, I told my students they get one bathroom pass a month and they all agreed. Anytime a student requests to use the bathroom, I make sure they understand that it needs to be an emergency because it's their one pass per month. I had a student use her pass on the first day of the month. I repeated what I always do. It's your one pass. Are you sure you want to use it today? She said yes and went. The next day she asks to use the phone and I say sure and go on teaching. Most kids need to use the phone to let their parents know they've got a detention or something. A minute later, she interrupts me saying her mom wants to talk to me. Turns out the little wench called her mom and told her I was refusing to let her go to the restroom and was scared she was going to pee in front of the class. Keep in mind she had never asked that day. The mom proceeds to ream me out on the phone and threaten to have me fired and sue me, etc. I have no idea what the hell she is talking about at this point, but eventually figure it out. She had told her daughter, if after the phone call I didn't let her go, to walk out and go straight to the administrator. I had no choice but to let her go at that point. I asked her why she lied to her mom and she just said I knew if I asked you would say no. Since I used my pass yesterday, now you can never say no again. TLDR. Student calls mom in middle of class to lie and try to get me fired. Devil's advocate. My parents are teachers, good ones. The funny thing is that in the majority of the population, everyone has a few really bad educational experiences, likely countable on one hand, and they graduated before it could continue. Teachers don't graduate. Every year they meet students that impress them in ways they would have never expected from them, as well as students that disappoint without fail. You get used to the balance and understand that it's pretty much a symptom of mankind that as whole parents make as whole kids. Really good PR can also generate as whole kids, but as wholery is usually just as hereditary as any other feature. Without fail, I met a bunch of as holes every single year I was in school. So much that I can't count anymore, and that's okay, because I don't spend my time steaming over them for the rest of my life. Teachers don't dwell on these experiences very heavily either. They can't afford to point. While some of you may have your one favorite teacher rage story, remember that teachers have the makings for hundreds in comparison to your one. The difficult thing about genuinely working to be a good teacher is that when a student is a dickhead, you just have to grit your teeth and work through it, because your job is to enable success for all students. Some kid who has never applied himself in his life can act like a omni-class asshole every day, staying just to one side of the line of acceptable behavior, and feel safe in the fact that the teacher is bound by law to respond in a limited capacity. A 16-year-old in a tap-out shirt will act pretty bad, as when mommy isn't in the room. There are asshole teachers too. They're everywhere. I work with some of them now. But as a student in an American public school, you have simple responsibility. Show up, do the work to get the grades to get out. Don't cheat on the floor. Some students manage the first one. Even fewer even try to manage the second one. It is astonishing how many students think that making a big scene, visibly and defiantly refusing to participate in class, or trying to take down or thwart a teacher they don't like, and at 17, most of us have such good reasons for disliking people trying to teach us, is going to be more beneficial to them than just living and letting live. When a teacher abuses their power, you should certainly use everything at your disposal to hold them accountable. But teachers get cheaty pay, cheaty hours, and cheaty treatment for trying to do something for a living that doesn't involve incarcerating, hurting, or swindling people for money. As kids in school, most of us have never had to work for anything in our lives. We are there simply by the grace of others. The majority of teachers are not there to make students' lives miserable. They teach because they believe in their work, and some kid who would rather be jerking off into his Mountain Dew and playing COD will never appreciate that. This is where the horror stories start. Whether intentionally or because of conditioning, teachers are treated as less than human by a majority of their students, and this pisses me off to no end. Jesus God. I teach at a 2-year school, Reed, community college, in the suburbs. Never had any violence or threats. Worst student experiences are all laziness related. One student was blonde, petite, and a total princess. She was in some sorority or another at a secondary school, but bombed out and returned back to her hometown CC to get her GPA back up. This was true of probably 15-20% of my students. She spent the majority of class time sitting in the back, flirting with an equally oblivious male student who I presume was her boyfriend. While discussing an assignment that constitutes 25% of a student's final grade, she cheerfully pipes up that her mom helped her do the work involved in the project. I'm moderately flabbergasted. You know you're not supposed to have outside help with course assignments, right? But my mom is a occupation, so she knows a lot about topic, and you're still talking about it. You know this is making you look really bad, right? But all she did was almost all the heavy lifting of the project. You really need to stop talking right now. You are digging a hole. Turns out that was just the beginning. The actual paper portion of the assignment, plagiarized whole cloth from Wikipedia. Cut and pasted. It took me a couple minutes to figure out what pages, though, because she went in and edited the pages to cover her tracks. Edits that, incidentally, were so inept that the usual Wikipedia types reverted them with comments about how weird they were. She probably thought she had gotten away with it, and she would have, if she hadn't edited the pages from her father's job. Turns out she didn't exactly understand how IP addresses work. I presented my chair with copies of the paper, the Wikipedia articles, the revisions with the IP address highlighted, and an IP lookup connecting the anonymous revisions to her father's place of business. That was about the time my chair let me know she was bringing her father by the department for a meeting. There was the usual complaining, and a vague implication that I was sexually harassing the student. Like a champ, my chair basically told them, if they wanted to go that route, he would contact the university system's legal counsel and they would see her in court. He then presented the father with all the documentation I had provided. She took a 0 in the class and I never heard from her, or her father, again. That's probably the worst overall experience. The most insulting was the guy who turned in the worst plagiarism job I've ever seen. 3 or 4 movie reviews just cut and pasted together. It was so bad that I swear it changed fonts twice. When I confronted the student, he insisted that this was not, in fact, his paper. He had left his thumb drive at home and asked his roommate to turn the paper in online on his behalf. Obviously, the roommate couldn't find his paper and kludged this thing together at the last minute point. Yes, his defense of blatant plagiarism was someone else plagiarized it for me. You fail the entire class, student, over an extra credit assignment. This post has made me lose the remaining shreds of faith in humanity that I had. I was a sub in a large urban district for a year, and I mostly stuck to younger kids luckily, but on the few occasions I had to work with junior or high school kids, it was horrible. I could write a damn book on it. However, here's the incident that stuck in my mind. I was subbing 6th grade, which is considered junior high in this district. The week before the state standardized test, TAKS. I've heard a lot of states have these, but Texas is obsessively ridiculous about them. I had to give these guys a practice tax, which obeyed the rules of the real test: no talking, eyes on own paper. As teachers we are obligated by law to not answer any questions like what does this word mean? I gave the kids these guidelines before passing out the test. Point naturally, the kids start talking, I attempt to shush them, and I think I even took up a couple tests within the first 5 minutes. Then I see all these hands in the air. Miss, what does this word mean? I tell them I'm not allowed to help them with things like that. Then more kids raise their hands. They keep talking, and I absolutely couldn't control them as much as I tried. There was one boy in the back of the class who was super sweet and wanted to try in school, so I put him in charge of the class while I went to the portable across from me to ask the teacher there for help. Point the second I left the portable, I heard laughter coming from it. I assumed they'd locked the door. That had happened to me before at other schools, but joke was on them. I had the key on a lanyard around my neck. I watched the other teacher's classroom for a little while. They were rowdy, but not mean. And then I saw what went down in my classroom. Point I was brought over back to my classroom with the other teacher, two intimidating butch security guards, and the author-faking principal there. Point it turns out that when the other teacher entered my portable, she was met by a barricade of a few trash cans, some tissue boxes, and a random trellis looking thing, really tall, that the teacher had in the back of the room. Point one security guard asked, "Why did you try to lock Misel out of the room?" The kids buzz around. "We didn't lock her out. The door wasn't locked, etc." I jump in and say that the room was indeed unlocked, and even if it were locked, I had a key. Point principal asks, "So why did you build this barricade around the door if it wasn't to keep her out?" Kids are silent for a while. Finally one of the kids, who was a total beach to me earlier, said, "We didn't lock her out, we just thought that when she came back, all of that would fall down on her and she would get hurt and we would laugh." After that came a stream of laughter. This was in front of, if you remember, me, another teacher, 2 milliseconds Trunchbull-esque security guards, and the author-faking principal. Point everyone in the class got at least lunch detention, minus that one boy who was a sweetheart, and the couple of kids who were the main perpetrators got calls home and possibly suspended. Point TLDR, I'm now a preschool teacher. Probably won't get read, but this is a story I have from when I was in 3rd grade. Point we had a girl that was a little sheet, came from a poor home life, was allowed to do stupid sheet because she was ad/ad. This was the mid-90s, so every 3rd kid in my class had ad apparently. At least that's what it seems like. Looking back, she probably was one of these beat the system kids. So one day, she's freaking out again and throwing pencils at the wall repeatedly, while the rest of us have to pay attention to the teacher and ignore her. Our teacher was ignoring her too. This kid pulled this sheet a lot. Point well, this day was different because my mother was the parent volunteer in the class that day. Our school district allows parent volunteers to do simple stuff, supervise reading groups, help organize things. While we were at recess, when I was in high school, she even helped do attendance in the office. What can I say? She was involved. Point anyway, so she sees this little brat and no one is doing anything about it, and she's had enough. Point my mother walks up to the girl, grabs all the pencils/pens she's been throwing, makes her put her arms to her sides and faces my mother, while my mother kneels to look her in the eye, and my mother says to her in her best, "I'm in charge here. You will listen and do what as I say, or you will regret it" voice. Mom tells her to get her act together, sit in her seat, listen to the teacher, and not disturb the other kids. Wide-eyed the girl turns red and sits in her seat, terrified of my mother. We continue as normal. I'm sure the teacher was thankful. She probably wasn't allowed to that. It's like stories I hear of retail workers not being allowed to stick up for themselves to a stupid customer and another customer sticks up for them. Point TLDR ain't no one facts with my mother. Ain't no one. Okay, I've got some great ones. I had a very unruly student who just kept disrupting class, so one day I had enough. I bent down to his level to explain we were going to the office cause of his behavior. He then punched me in the face. I was livid. I put him in the office for 5 minutes, looked at my boss who was dumbfounded, and went back to teach my class. In the end I loved this little boy, he just had behavior issues. Also, I don't think he was getting enough to eat at home, because every day at lunch we would just pour food into his mouth, and he'd still ask for more. Broke my heart. I had a little girl who, when she did not get her way, would have the meltdown of all meltdowns. Him talking, screaming, crying, kicking, punching. But that is not the worst of it. She would proceed to rip off her clothes, but naked, pee on the floor / on herself, and roll it in. It was a sight to behold. I also had a 7-year-old boy who weighed close to 100 pounds. He also had anger issues. One day didn't want to put on his coat to go outside. Being we live in Alaska, you need your damn coat. I explained to him that it was simple coat or office you chose. He chose to push me. Me being 5 feet 2, 110 pounds myself, it was enough to make me tumble back. I looked him dead in the eye and said, I will not tolerate you pushing me, and I'm going to speak with your parents. He put on his coat and his father, and I had a nice chat that afternoon. I've also had a child bite another child in the face. She was a known biter, and it reduced me to having to hold her hand all day, which just made it hard to teach my class fluent times, and that is why I'm working on my bachelor's in science, and not childhood anymore. Being a kid who was always teased in school, having a few popular kids who do teasing, made me feel cool. So one time, me and another one of these popular kids were teasing this other kid, calling him gay. In all honesty, I don't know if the kid was gay or not. Maybe he was, which in retrospect for him probably faking sucks, and makes me feel bad to think about, as I hold a very pro stance for homosexuals in my adult life, simply because he was an overweight, socially awkward, shy kid who had no friends, was smart, and got good grades. My teacher, in a calm, no big deal voice, asks me to come out into the hall. Then she starts asking me seemingly demonizing questions in a pissed tone of voice about my sexuality, if I like boys, things like that, and teasing me about it in a manner that made me feel incredibly awkward. She asked if it made me feel uncomfortable with her saying that to me, which I said yes. She concludes, now you know how such and such kid's name feels. So before you open your mouth and tease other people in a mean way, think about how you'd feel if it were being done to you. I went back in later in the day, apologized to the kid, and reverted my outlook on that sort of behavior ever since. The other kid who was doing the teasing was called out into the hallway and given the same lesson. The other kid continued to be a bully and a prick the rest of the next 2 years we were in the same school together, and I stopped being his friends not long after this incident. My stepmother recently retired after 32 years of teaching. She shared with me several horror stories throughout the years. Here are a few that I can recall. She had a student in one of her ESL classes, about 8 years ago or so, threatened to kill her. She had heard threats like that often, so she just threw him out of the class. That evening when she was walking to her car, she noticed that her car had been keyed, her tires slashed, and her windows broken in. In the inside of the car there was a note that said something like, "Next time I hope you are in the car." A student spat in her face. I believe this had happened a few times. There was a student who was extremely violent. He constantly fought with other students, etc. He was in her morning ESL block, and he wouldn't take his hat off, nor would he take his seat. So, she told him to just leave. He refused to leave, and ended up getting in her face. She was about 60 years old. This student threatened to hit her, and right then another student, who really liked her, got up and fought the guy. I was a tar during summer school for her. I saw some amazing stuff. I couldn't believe the level of patience she had with these kids. They were so terrible. Some of them would just cuss her out in the hopes that she would send them out. Some would simply say, "I don't need school because I'm going to work in the fields anyways." Or, "I only go here because they make me, and I'm going to get pregnant so I can leave." It was really sad. She told me that the quality of students became worse every 5 years or so. The last 5 years she taught there were the worst. Edit. Just so it is clear, my stepmom was an excellent teacher. She is incredibly intelligent, patient, and humorous. Many of her students, prior to the final 5 years of teaching, ended up doing really well in life, and it was fun to walk around and have former students come up to her to thank her. Of course, if you teach in a really bad area, chances are you will encounter similar issues. There was an ear riot once in my high school, all caused by one kid plagiarizing Fight Club as Seniors, we had an assignment called Senior Speak Out where you were basically allowed to write a speech about any topic. You'd present to your English class, and then the class would vote, and then there was a series of rounds leading up to 5 students presenting to the entire school, and then there was a final vote. Point I got to the semi-finals and another kid presented a speech about how the world is bullshit, you follow what everyone else says, you aren't free, and the whole thing was filled with facts and shit. I immediately realized that the speech was essentially Fight Club, except he missed the entire point at the end. I knew I was going to lose to the kid. At the very least he was a good speaker. I didn't mention it to the administration that the speech was clearly plagiarized. Point cut to the kid making it to the finals and the teachers tell him that if he wants to read it, he needs to cut out some of the swears, because there's a law in public schools that during mandatory presentations you can only swear a certain amount or whatever. The kid refuses and begins telling everyone that he was censored because of the speech's message point. So the day comes for the finals. Him and his friends stand outside the auditorium handing out copies of his speech. At the end of the presentation, the little bastard runs up to the mic and starts reading his speech, and then has to be removed from the stage. Naturally, idiot kids start freaking out and rioting as if the kid is some kind of hero. Then kids start skipping class and rioting in the hallways. Gets on the local news. Not every kid followed the suit of insanity, and lots of kids noticed that it was blatant plagiarism, which should have been the initial reason why he wasn't allowed to present. A friend asked me to write an article for the school newspaper that was coming out the next day about the event. I compiled quotes from Fight Club compared to his speech, which proved it was plagiarism. Point. After submitting the article, the English teacher in charge of the paper came up to me and apologized because the article legally could not be published. Apparently there's also a law which states you are not allowed to publish material that implicates another student of a crime or punishable act. I'm probably in a unique position here, being only 17. But I'm a qualified swim instructor and have been instructing karate for years. I do teach and have been told by multiple employers that I do a damn good job. Point. Working in community centers, though, means that you're dealing with a lot of ridiculous shit. Point. Parents oftentimes don't realize that kids being enrolled in swimming lessons need to already be comfortable in the water. Or maybe they do know and just don't give a shit. Either way, there's always that one kid that's horrified of the water. There you are, 16 or 17 years old, left with a sobbing kid that refuses to do anything. Sure, you could try to help them through their fear, but since the community center sees every single kid as a bundle of cash, they've stuck you with 6 of the little buggers. Spend too much time with one, and the parents will literally stick a stopwatch in your face after the lesson to say that the time you spent with their kid was disproportional. Think fast, you've got university to pay for, and a boss that doesn't give a shit about you. Point. I had kids that had medical issues that I wasn't informed of, doing an endurance swim in a middle lane with 7 kids, praying for nothing to go wrong. Start to do a head count for the 20th time that minute, one is faking missing. I legitimately thought that kid was on the bottom of the pool. The adrenaline is pumping, and I'm about to blow a long whistle blast, that being the oh shit big faking emergency right over here, everyone get the fuck out signal, and suddenly, I hear screaming from the deck. The good news is that it's the missing kid. The bad news is that it's the missing kid, and he is screaming. Within 20 seconds he's spirited away by the deck supervisor, and I'm left to teach my class wondering what the fuck just happened. Point. Turned out he had an inner ear problem that flared up. An inner ear problem nobody bothered to tell me about. Didn't get in one speck of trouble, but that incident actually left me with a temporary case of PTSD. Didn't sleep for a good few months. Of course, I have some funny stories about karate, like how an instructor accidentally smacked a kid in the face once, but problems don't tend to arise there as much. If a kid misbehaves, you give them push-ups until they're ready to puke. Point. TLDR teach swimming. Some parents enroll kids that will try to break your nose if attempt to get them wet because they're afraid. Kid with inner ear problem gave me PTSD. Karate is awesome. This event happened this year. I'm a special education teacher, and in my district, SPED students do not attend resource class until the second week of school, primarily as a means of allowing the teachers time to both observe the student and begin work on all the necessary IEPs and eligibilities, which are invariably expired due to the lethargic nature of most SPED teachers in my district. After observing all my students, reading diligently through their IEPs, and creating all their individualized trackers, and what I like to call their tools for success, we started class in the second official week of school. Class started smoothly. Most of my kids come in with minimal knowledge, both academically, most are at minimum 4 years behind their grade level, and behaviorally, so I always try to assert myself and my regulations as steadfastly as possible in the opening weeks. However, as class started, there was a new face I didn't recognize. She was not on my CASA load, and I could not remember anything about her IEP. Let's call her Isabel. Isabel came in and diligently took a seat for the first 5 minutes, but during the time in which I introduced my rewards and consequences for classroom behavior, Isabel inexplicably began screaming and got out of her seat and ran towards the back of my classroom. The ensuing 5 minutes still make my hair stand on end. Isabel continued to scream and scream, a blood-curdling sound reminiscent of something from a banshee tale, while she proceeded to throw chairs, desks, and eventually threw a computer monitor on the ground. I'm not allowed to put my hands on students nominally, and so I escorted my class out of my room and cordoned off the classroom until the resource officers could arrive. By the time they got there, Isabel had urinated on herself, struck me once on the arm, and attempted to bite me, all while continuing to scream. I was dumbstruck. I had never seen such an animalistic reaction for no apparent reason. Little did I know that earlier in the day, Isabel had attacked a general education teacher in the same manner, and administration had opted to relocate her to my class, due to my good reputation for keeping the toughest EBD kids in line. Despite the insanity, we were able to return to class eventually, and this year has turned out to be a great success for many children. While I still have trouble from the occasional BD outburst, the vast majority of my students are on track to make significant gains this year in both their reading levels and content knowledge. What a way to start a year. When I was in 10th grade, we had this crazy kid in my history class. Anything at all would set him off. I once saw him go into a screaming fit because a kid behind him closed his textbook too loudly. We'll call him J. So one day I'm sitting in class, maybe 2 desks behind J. This girl, who was known to be the school hoe, I'll call her Lindsay, tells him that he's an ugly piece of shit. Well, Jay goes apeshit on her. He starts beating the shit out his desk with swift 2-handed pounds, as if this desk had just wrapped his mother. I mean, violently beating this poor desk. He then proceeds to pick the desk up, turn himself to Lindsay in a state of great stupor, and bellows forth a monstrous battle cry. At this point I'm thinking he's going to kill her. I do what any self-respecting gentleman would do. I took him down. I ran at him as fast as I could, which with the limited space I had, was only good enough to knock him down. As we're both going down, I remember he was holding a desk above his head. We hit the floor, and the desk lands on top of me, breaking my arm. At this point I'm out of commission. Because of the way I had hit him, he was pushed away from the falling desk, so he was totally unharmed. He then stands up and starts trying to run at Lindsay. My teacher intervenes by swiftly pushing a desk between the two, which gives him a few seconds to get in front of Jay. When he gets in front of him, Jay just pushes him over the desk on top of Lindsay, then runs out of the class crying. Maybe a minute later, security and administration shows up. I go to the hospital to get fixed up. While I'm in the hospital, my mother gets a phone call from the school principal. I got suspended for 2 weeks because I struck and injured a mentally handicapped student. And I find out 2 days later from a friend that the administration decided to fire the teacher because they considered the desk he pushed a weapon, and when he fell over the desk onto Lindsay, when Jay pushed him, her head struck a desk behind her and gave her a concussion. My wife is a teacher. There was a family which moved into the area from New Orleans, with maybe 4 adults living in the same home, and even more kids. Well, the child that my wife taught had quite a few disciplinary issues, more extreme than most. My wife has taught at many inner city schools and is not naive by any stretch. Keep in mind that we are talking kindergarten or first grade here. Forget which exactly point anyways. The kid kept acting out, fighting, hitting teachers etc. Which to me is completely unacceptable and super rare even in bad areas. The kid was going through the process of being deemed special needs so that he could be kept out of general classes. Grandparents, who apparently were raising the kid, maybe it was auntie, but I think grandparents, were fighting this, but seemed to have no other interest in his academic success. It eventually came out that none of the adults in the house were all on some form of disability. The child was apparently being instructed to hit people, specifically teachers, if anyone didn't do what he wanted. They were basically trying to get this kid certified as emotionally disabled so he could get better gov benefits. Blows my mind. Completely sacrificing the kid's future so that they could get some more of the dole. This was a upper middle class neighborhood. No one was missing meals here. People like this should be drug out in the street and shot. Ruinous behavior for us all. I have heard some crazy stuff about the schools in the hood that she used to work at. My mom is a retired teacher of 32 years. She taught 3rd grade for the last 14 years of her career, and she cites this as the worst thing that's happened. She had a student transfer to her class who had just moved here from Mexico with his family. His mother told my mom that her husband was abusive, so they came here to Hawaii to get away from him. As the school year progressed, my mom noticed that this boy didn't have essential things. So she would pay out of her own pocket for things for him like shoes or a Halloween costume so he could participate in the school parade. Then my mom started to notice he was coming to school with scratches by his neck and bruises all over. She asked the boy where he was getting these scratches from. He broke down in tears and said his mom was doing it to him. So, as is protocol, my mom sent him to the health room and notified the acting vice principal, who in turn is supposed to notify Child Protective Services. But what does he do instead? He calls the boy's mother. So she comes to the school and says, oh, he got into a fight with his brother. That's where the scratches came from. The next day, the boy didn't come to school. My mom called the other schools that his siblings were attending, thinking maybe he transferred. But none of his siblings were there anymore either. Overnight, the family was gone. 15 years later, my mom still remembers the boy's name and wonders if he's even still alive. A 3rd grader accused me of hitting her on her hands. I didn't. I was put on paid administrative leave for 1 week. The cops had to investigate. Girl changed her story. Once the cops showed up, my principal told me I had to tell her she was still welcome in my class. Subbing one time in the ghetto in LA. Middle schooler says, "Motherfucker, I know what car you drove in here today." When I asked him to please be quiet, my exact words, teaching history, watching Schindler's List with the lights off for effect/intensity, student decides it would be funny to pull out a piece of paper and sheet on it, crumple it up, and throw it out the door. Turns out the year before he was swinging his sheet-filled underwear around in the locker room. Feckle freak FTW. He got expelled right away because it was a private school and the VP was my really good friend. Accused of staring at students' boobs. This was of course during a parent conference in which the students was mad because I would not accept her assignment during the 5-minute passing period. Never piss off a 15-year-old girl who is on probation. Tape recorded by a student as a form of extortion, blackmail because I refused to allow her to modify all of her assignments to her choosing, so it could be easier. Her words, not mine. We got into an argument about it, and she pulls out her phone, records me, hoping I say something that could get me fired. Student gets in my face and tells me I'm 18, I'll fight you right now. Right on front of the administrator. Countless times I have been told to fuck off, you're a dick. This class is boring, usually said by a student who has 15 or so absences for the quarter. By the 6th week of school, I've been teaching 17 years. Those are the worst things I can remember off the top of my head. Sure, I can add 20 more to the list. This is a type of sheet you deal with as a teacher. I teach alternative at-risk youth for the last 7 years, and it has become unbearable. I think I'm going to change careers and try and get a job teaching at the private school here. It's cheat pay, but at least you get students who at least want a good grade and are, in the majority, willing to work for it. Plus, private schools are not obligated to teach every student by federal mandate. That's what really fucks things up. That means you have to teach kids who don't want to be there. When a kid says, "This sucks, this class is boring," and obviously he's the only one doing it, not the whole class. I want to be able to throw a little stfo at them, but I can get fired for that. I've come close to getting fired a couple of times. Parents are a nightmare too. What really sucks for me is that 17 years ago my biggest goal/dream in life was to be a teacher, and I'm not saying that I have not made some fabulous friends and taught some amazing scholars either. What I'm saying is what my first mentor teacher told me: eventually the apathy gets to you. He made it 32 years. This story isn't nearly as good as any of the others here, but it nearly got me in a lot of trouble, so I thought I'd share it. Point in the course of my masters I'd had a single course. That meant 2 hours twice a week of lab and review, plus homework and office hours. My office hours were, for reasons that to this day escape me, from 9 to 11 on Monday. Homework was assigned Friday and due Friday. No one ever came to my office hours, and the people who did were invariably the motivated ones, which worked out pretty well. Except when it didn't. Point about 2 weeks into class, this guy comes into office hours. I've only known the class 2 weeks, but I graded the first homework, I graded the first quiz. I'm getting a good feel for them, especially this kid. This kid is, let us say, not the brightest crayon, but he tries hard, which I respect. Unfortunately, in electrical engineering, there comes a point that trying hard is no longer enough, and you need to be a certain level of smart to continue succeeding. But I digress. He comes in at 9, has no idea how to do a problem. I try teasing him through it, offering hints, writing down the equations he needs. No dice. Eventually I walk him through it and ask him to replicate. He can't, and he says he still doesn't get it. I walk him through it a completely different way. Still doesn't work. I'm still doing fine, but I can see him getting increasingly frustrated. My office hour is about to end, and I need to get to class. I say something to him to the extent of, there's several general paths to every solution. If you don't get path A, try path B. If you don't get path B, path C, path D, and if you don't get path D, maybe you should switch majors. I say this with a bit of a giggle, meaning it as a joke. He doesn't seem to find it funny, but doesn't say anything. Whatever, I get it. That's not funny under some circumstances. 2 months later, after the first exam, the professor calls me in. It seems there has been an anonymous complaint leveled against me by a student who said that I told him to consider switching majors. I explained the situation to the professor, who said that he understood, but that students can be sensitive, blah blah. Basically, I'm okay for now, but don't do it again. And you know what? I'm okay with that. I understand, not everyone finds things like that funny. But what really pisses me off is that he waited until after the first exam to complain. He waited 2 fucking months. Honestly, it felt like he was getting ready to blame me for his bad score on his exam. Substitute teacher here. Walking the hall looking for my classroom around lunchtime, a female teacher came running out of her room. As I walked by the open door, I saw a 4th grade classroom in full fight mode. Everyone out of their seats and 2 kids swinging fists, desks knocked over, books on the floor everywhere. No teacher cranked God mode up to 8, 9, and 10 include very foul language. 4th graders, though, and walked in like angry Thor. Strange, very large angry man storming toward the center of the melee. I think I started with "What do you think you're doing?" followed by "Unholy mother of God voice, everyone sit down. You two get those books off the floor, pick up those desks and sit in them." Everything had stopped when I raged into the room. Of course, no adults around to protect them from the strange angry man. I stayed and glared at the silent class until their teacher got back with the principal/school discipline guy. Never knew which. It was a new school to me as a substitute. She thanked me later, and I said something like, "You looked like you needed a hand." No problem. Moral of this story: if you want to know a school, really know it. Talk to the substitute teachers. They have nothing on the line, and know and compare all the schools in their area. We know the good, the bad, and the ugly. Point by the way, best behaved class I ever subbed for. 5th grade teacher had a drawer full of small treats and toys, and her class made sure I knew it. Never saw anything like it before or since. Palm, meat hand. Students in the middle. Reminds me of a similar episodes, of an 8-year-old we had at my first school. I taught gym to these kids and they were all great and sweet, except for this special needs 8-year-old who was tall and very overweight. For some reason, all the regular teachers in his class were women, and one day he figured out he could match them physically. His primary teacher was a tiny, 48 kg 28-year-old. That's pretty damn bad considering the fits he threw from time to time. I tell you, that kid could throw a chair like there's no tomorrow. Anyway, I was the hall monitor one day and I hear screaming and fighting from his classroom, and I run in there. He's kicked a girl or so, and is in a full fight with the teacher, who's of course just trying to restrain him, and what's worse, he's winning. He pushes her back, and she falls down. I shout his name, and he charges me, not unlike an angry rhino as I recall. Big mistake of course, at 1m85 and 90 kilos he's still a lightweight. I dragged him into a corner, and give him a yelling to I've never did before or since. Clearly he's not used to that. He immediately clamps down, and starts crying, and the situation diffused. I'm not exactly proud of manhandling a troubled kid, and giving him an epic scolding, but I felt it was valid for the situation. After that he never gave me any trouble, was extremely polite, and I just had to throw a look in his direction if trouble was brewing to make him back off. Sadly he continued to be little Hitler to the rest of the teachers and students. After half a year he was sent to a special needs school. I taught a stage combat class at a private college. It was my first ever time teaching professionally, and the entire class was great, except for this one freshman. Day 1, I hand out the syllabus and let them know that they'll have to watch fight movies for homework, as well as perform scripted fight scenes. He informed me that he was a pacifist, and therefore wouldn't be able to participate in any violence. I informed him that there wouldn't be any actual violence, because every fight move would be pre-planned, rehearsed, and performed with consent. He didn't understand, but he let it go until the end of class. After class, I informed everyone that I needed to know if they had any physical injuries I should know about, so that I didn't assign them any techniques that would further complicate their injuries. Best student tells me that he has a condition where he will just pass out if he gets startled, overheated, or if someone touches him without him expecting it. He said he had it since childhood. I asked what the name of the condition was, so I could look it up that night and be able to accommodate him better, and he said I don't remember. Something in Japanese. He was obviously lying, but I know health issue stuff can get sticky, especially if he had a mental issue that I wasn't aware of. I went to my department chair and asked him about this kid. Turns out he's a notorious schoolwork dodger and chronic liar, but we've been informed by the dean of students or somebody that we have to accommodate him. The chair and I both took him aside before the next class and discussed him possibly dropping the course. After all, he was a non-theater major, so the class was completely optional for him. He refused. Over the course of the class, this kid would randomly pretend to pass out whenever he didn't feel like participating. I'm a lifelong martial artist who's studied stage and film combat for about 7 years now. I'm familiar with a genuine pass out. It only happened to this kid near mats, or if he was already laying down. We worked rolling 1 week, and he was surprisingly great at it, so I heaped on the praise thinking he might participate more, since he was talented at this particular exercise. Next class, he comes in with his arm menacing with a doctor's note saying no stage combat for 3 weeks. This conveniently took him out of the final. Saw him that night elsewhere on campus, no sling in sight, using full range of his arm. I gave him a specialized written assignment for his final, since he couldn't do any physical aspects of it. He handed in half the work, then went to my department chair about his bad grade, also complaining about his poor participation grade. Since I had been keeping the chair informed, the grade stood, no contest. He'd somehow had a 4.0 before my class. That didn't stand. As a current teacher and former fuck up of a student, thought I'd share some things I regret from my high school years. 1. My trig teacher had been in the country for 10 years, but was just learning English from the Ukraine. So naturally she became a target. Close to the end of term she handed back an exam I had done poorly on, and I knew she'd be entering the grades into her computer at the end of class, as she always did, so I stole the ball out of her computer mouse and unplugged her keyboard from the tower. Her computer went to sleep, and as the bell rang she began to freak out about how her computer was broken, so I offered to take a look at it for her. She ran down to the office to drop off some papers for the principal, and I proceeded to undo my sabotage. When she came back and it was fixed, she rewarded me with 10 bonus points on the exam too. Same teacher would have students take turns presenting problems from the homework on the blackboard as she walked around to make sure everyone had done it. My problem was easy, so with the extra time I colored the seat of her chair white with chalk. She was wearing a black skirt and didn't notice for 3 periods. Interesting follow up. 2 days later my parents came in for parent-teacher conferences and Mrs. Herb proceeded to tell them about what a joy I was to have in class, one of her favorite students. We had a regular substitute teacher with a severe lisp. Rumor has it she slipped and hit her throat on a guardrail during a sobriety test, so we used to challenge each other to get her to say amusing things. I thought I'd won when I elicited oshkosh be gosh until my friend Ryan topped me with the Shawshank Redemption .4. Probably the worst. My freshman year of high school we had a gun scare at my school. Someone brought a replica musket in for a history presentation. Yay, New Hampshire. So we were all herded into the closest classrooms to keep us out of harm's way. For me that meant spending time with my physical science teacher, a woman in her first year at my school. We were all crowded into the corner least accessible from the door, ironically across from several floor-to-ceiling windows in a first-floor classroom, when Ms. Derp heard a noise in the hallway. She waved us all back and began to creep forward along the wall so as to peek through the small window cut in the door. I could see her shaking nervously, so naturally I felt the need to act. I grabbed the teacher's edition textbook from her desk and, getting as close as I could behind her, slammed it loudly to the floor. She jumped and screamed, "Take whoever you want, just don't hurt me." After that there was a tacit agreement in class. We would all get C's if we kept our mouths shut. She tried to transfer to another school at winter break, but was told she needed to finish out the year. Upon receiving this news she took me and a few of my usual cohorts to the side and told us that we were the reason she was leaving. I think it was meant to guilt us, but at the time it was like a badge of honor. TLDR, read the damn stories. It's not fucking Kafka, people. So I have a neighbor who is a sub for middle school and high school. Our study hall course has a bunch of kids in it who just stick around and do nothing, mostly because they are spoiled rich children who come from spoiled rich adults. So I'm 17, senior year, and stuck in this study hall. My neighbor, Mrs. P, comes in as the sub, since the original teacher was with child. She tries to get the class to remain silent while she reads over the rules, but that doesn't work out because one kid's phone goes off and he just takes the call. Mrs. P looks at the guy with a severe glance of disapproval, waiting for him to turn off the phone for a verbal beatdown point. Instead, the guy gets up and walks outside, still talking on the phone. This kid, over the next 2 weeks, acts like a ringleader so all the others can do whatever they want and act like the teacher has no say. We had guys pull down girls' sweet pants and panties, take pictures of homework questions, and even had a kid masturbate in the front of the class 2 weeks later, and Mrs. P is sitting at the desk, trying to tell these clowns to stop talking when she screams. This scream was so primal, so full of pent-up rage, everybody stopped breathing and looked at her. She just started yelling out complete gibberish, then looked at me. I saw my neighbor, the lady who had joked with my family, eaten with us, and raise her children next to me, look at me with these eyes that begged me to assist her in some way. But I was so shocked that this was happening that I didn't react. She was so flabbergasted after this she slumped upright and started crying. She left the room, and while she was making her way down to the first floor to ask for another sub to take over, everybody started talking shit about her. I got really pissed because I just saw one of the nicest people in the world get faked by these brats. And when one of the girls next to me said she deserved it with that crappy Mac you lost it point, I slammed my hand down on the table and yelled at her. And when her friends tried to yell back, I shouted so loudly that I shut them up. By this point, I was standing, don't remember anything but yelling at this one girl, who was scared out of her mind that she couldn't throw money at this problem in front of her and it'd go away, and barking at this girl, saying that person who just left here was one of the most extraordinary people who ever came into this room. And you and your friends acted like complete assholes to her, so you could get a cheap laugh. Fuck you, and fuck your friends. Think about that. And then I sat down, and everybody looked to the door, because Mrs. P had been standing there the whole time. She'd come back for her keys, and just started bawling again when I heard my outburst point. Then she left, and the class took turns between insulting her and insulting me. I'm not a teacher, but I was one of the few kids at my school who bothered with work. We had 4 kinds of kids. The I fucking hate this piece of shit place. I'd rather be doing other crap. The I don't like school, but my parents make me go, so I try a little. The school is okay. I know I need it for future life, and the I actually enjoy learning people point. My story is about a guy from the first group. A little bit of background. He grew up in what essentially was a drug den, living off benefits and thinking he could get away with everything. He was bigger and stronger than other kids his age. One day in my final year of GCSEs, 16 years old, we were sitting in our design and technology class, only to hear a lot of noise from the room next door. Screaming, banging noises etc. This is what actually happened. Instead of doing his end of year project, he was messing about with a heavy machinery, lathes, pillar drills. The teacher, a 5 feet, slightly larger middle-aged woman, who was very nice but strict, told him to cut it out and get back to work. He didn't listen to her and kept doing whatever he was doing. From this point onward, I know what happened via teachers and other staff, so she turns the power off to everything in the room. He goes absolutely ballistic, starts swearing at her, throws a stool at a window, nearly hitting another student. Then, he attempts to storm out the room. She gets in the way, tells him to go sit and calm down. He shoves her aside, clears out of the room, bangs the door so hard it breaks, sweeps a laser printer off its shelf. At this point, the whole department has heard this, and one of the teachers coming out of the main building sees this unfold through a window. When this guy finally gets outside, he is still swearing, throwing death threats at everybody and so on. The teacher that saw what happened storms in and rugby tackles the guy to the floor and puts him in a basic arm lock so he couldn't injure anyone. Kid gets suspended, fails school. Teacher who stopped him gets a serious demotion and quits shortly afterwards. 3 years down the line, that kid got busted for dealing drugs and stealing cars and is currently sitting in jail. TLDR kid goes berserk in class, damaging school property and endangering students and teachers. Teacher who stops him gets serious punishment. Quits after. Kid is now in jail for unrelated reasons, not getting out anytime soon. A few bullet points from being one of those kids, and also being one of the kids who saw everything. Grade school, saw a kid get stabbed in the belly with a pencil by the resident dickhead. Spent 2 hours going back and forth from the office to the library during a book fair, because I didn't have the right amount of money for the book I wanted. Ratted on a kid, then had an emotional breakdown because of it. In class middle school, a kid showed me the gun he brought to school and I screamed. It was a very real looking BB gun, and I was afraid of guns as a kid. High school, a kid doused his arm in lighter fluid and lit it on fire in my bio class. My math teacher, who was English, had an affair with one of the students. He was deported. One of my now good friends, as a student, had an affair with her assistant volleyball coach. I once hit biggest jock on campus with a tennis ball so hard I knocked his ass out. We were in the tennis section of our phys ed class. Fainted once during PE because I was an asthmatic and forgot to bring my rescue inhaler. Almost got beaten up by a guy because I told his girlfriend's sister to leave me the fuck alone during class. In her defense, she had Down syndrome and I was a people-hating queer boy who wanted to disappear. She thought I was her boyfriend and I treated her like shit. I was moved to another class as a senior. I jerked it in the boys one day after school and was caught by one of the janitors. I'll let him watch until I was done. One of the English teachers I had freshman year during my senior year had to be escorted out of the school because she had a breakdown in the middle of class. Her husband, who was a cop, had been killed in the line of duty about a month before. She taught remedial English and the kids that day told her that her husband had killed himself to get away from her. Actually had a kid in my school named Biff. Not a teacher, but a elementary school experience point. When my sister was in 5th grade, there was 2 different teachers you could get. She got this teacher, Mrs. Lowe. One day she came home with a story that the teacher got so mad at a male student she walked up and threw his desk over. In my elementary school, your desk was basically your locker, so if it wasn't in your backpack, it was in your desk. She flipped his sh*t. Whatever may have happened to her, she was still teaching 5th grade when I got to that grade. I was so happy to learn I got the other teacher. For half the school year I was subject to a poor teacher with a system designed to make you fall behind. As soon as you missed one homework assignment, you had to go outside and finish your homework, which meant you missed today's lesson, which meant you missed today's homework, etc. It was the first time I got anything less than a B after a talk with the school principal, where he pulled up my standardized test scores and told me I was smarter than he was. To my 5th grade mind, I didn't quite realize he meant smarter than he was at that age. I got moved to Mrs. Lowe's class, and she turned out to be a great teacher. My grades rebounded almost instantly. I have no idea what that boy did to piss her off such that she would do that, but I could see she was a firm but fair teacher. None of the bully type characters in my class ever tried anything with her, since I'm sure the story had gotten around. I know you want schools. I'm an early childhood teacher. While studying, I volunteered at a kindergarten. Every fortnight, if the weather was good, we walked to the library with the 4-year-olds, then played on the neighboring playground. I wanted to discourage children from hogging the swings and asking to be carried along the monkey bars. These are 2 things my kindergarten lacks. So I would climb up onto the jungle gym, wait my turn, then have a go on the slide. A boy we'll call Liam followed his little sister up. She was about 15 months old, walking somewhat steadily. She sat down on the slide first. My memory is a bit blurry, but her brother Liam was impatient / over encouraging and pushed her. The other teacher, watching, caught her as she landed on the edge of the slide. If it weren't for her, the baby would have fallen almost 2 meters to the ground. I withdrew from trying to catch her, quickly analyzed the situation, and decided the biggest growling of his life was needed. I grabbed him by one arm and lifted him up. I feel guilty about this as I never manhandle other people's children. I don't think I hurt him, but I'm sure it went through his mind that, if I could do that, what else could I do? The growling went something along the lines of, "You do not push your sister off the slide. If you push your sister or any of the other children off that slide, they could break their arms or their legs, and it would be your fault." He started crying at this point. I'm sorry it's hard for you to hear, but it is true. You never push, kick, scratch anyone, because you can seriously hurt them. Okay, do you want to go down the slide? He shakes his head. Do want to go down the stairs? He shakes his head. I look at the other teacher warily. She shrugs. He's just sulking. Eventually the other teacher realizes that he's causing a hold up, so she gets up and guides him off. Naturally he goes and cries to his mum. The following Monday his mother brought him in saying that he was scared to come back because he was scared of the teacher. She never spoke to me, and when I brought it up with the main 2 teachers they brushed it off, saying he needed to be told off. His mum isn't strict enough. You saw how he was making his sister do things. He needed a growling. That made me feel better. I only bring up the arm pulling with close friends. I don't know if the teacher saw me or if she knew that lifting a child up with one arm doesn't hurt them. Regardless, I should have picked him up another way. TLDR, a 4-year-old almost pushed his baby sister off a slide. I lifted him roughly and gave him the growling of his life. When I was in 6th grade at primary school in Australia, I was in my last few weeks before moving interstate, and we were sitting outside a classroom waiting for a teacher to escort us down the street for a sports trip. Well, where we were sitting we had a direct view to where the teacher was standing out the front of the class writing on the blackboard. He had a student in his class that was a straight out troublemaker. Everyone had had trouble with him, and he was on his last legs at the school. So this kid starts arguing about something, and the teacher asks him to get up and go to the teacher's desk. Next thing, this kid is throwing punches. The teacher does what anyone would do and tries to avoid being hit. In the process of blocking a punch, the kid gets caught off balance and goes back against the blackboard. He hit his back on the little ledge on the edge of the blackboard made to hold chalk. The principal comes down, and the teacher who was meant to take us to sport takes the class for the rest of the day, while we sit in the library wondering what will happen. The next day we hear the teacher is on a month's stress leave and the student is suspended. The parents are threatening to sue, and the whole thing will be investigated. Due to the fact that the whole class had witnessed it, my friends and I were never asked about it. I moved a few weeks later, but I heard from a friend that to keep the peace he later left the school. The investigation found the teacher was in the right, but he no longer wanted to stay teaching there. The student was allowed back at the school, but later got expelled for fighting with another student. The teacher also moved interstate and is happily teaching younger students, grades 1 and 2. TLDR, disruptive kid gets called to the front of class then starts throwing punches. In self-defense the teacher knocks the kid back and the kid gets hurt. Parents threaten to sue and the teacher gets investigated. Nothing ever comes of it, but teacher leaves as he no longer wants to work at that school. In my 10th grade engineering class, students would constantly smoke pot in the classroom. To be fair, it's a pretty large room. It has a section for the normal class, a computer lab, work tables and a wood cutting room, so they would usually go unnoticed if they hid the smoke and covered up the smell with some burning wood. One day in another period they decided to do a smoking circle out in the open. Of course this didn't go unnoticed, and the police were involved, and it got the teacher in a bunch of trouble. Now let's go to 11th grade. They are still smoking and showing up to class. Either they aren't getting caught, either because they are hiding it better, or the teacher is turning a blind eye. I don't know. But we are going to the Technology Student Association State Conference this year, and it's sponsored by the engineering teacher, and it's mostly engineering students that go. They managed to sneak in a shit ton of alcohol that year and got sheet-faced on the first day. They ripped off the wallpaper in their hotel room and put a hole in the wall. The management eventually noticed and a sheetstorm occurred. I don't know what ended up happening to them. And lastly, in 12th grade 2 weeks ago, 2 students were caught smoking pot in the library during RTV production class. One of them had a scholarship to the Naval Academy and lost it. They both got a 10-day suspension. Also for one of them, it was the 6th time he has been caught. TLDR, people keep smoking pot in my classes and faked up a hotel room at school competition. I'm not a teacher, although I'm 3 years away from being one. Assuming this thread doesn't make me change my mind, but I have a pretty good story on how faked the system could be. In grade 7 I transferred to a different school and sat beside a girl named Taylor. Taylor was one of the few in the area whose parents actually had a substantial amount of money. The rest of us were all lower middle class. So this girl made the decision that, because she was rich, she didn't have to do schoolwork. So this little girl would drum her long fake fingernails on her desk during the lessons, and when it was time to do the questions herself she would automatically announce, "I don't get it," without trying even once. She used to demand to copy my tests, and when I didn't let her she'd try anyways. It got to the point that I would separate my desk from hers a good foot and build a wall with my pencil case and textbook so she couldn't see. When I would ask her why she didn't just try to learn the material, she looked at me like I was an idiot and said, "I'm rich, so I don't have to." I saw her although high school. She was in the special needs classrooms, as in with the kids with Downs and autism. The girl isn't stupid, she just needed someone to not accept her sheet and make her do her work. Instead she got a teacher aide that would spoon feed the questions to her and get her easier work every time. That's just the way the system works. I got this comment on my teaching evaluations from last term, probably the most abusive one I will ever get. Take away multiple readings. If there is 1 reading per week I will do it, between 5 to 10 pages, nothing more. Maybe watch an interesting movie, or make it added lecture time for the GC to lecture on what is most important about what is brought up in Bera's lecture. This has been useless. Stop making college students feel like babies. We are not. Do not talk down to US. Do not expect us to raise our hand and answer questions that is for children in kindergarten. Please just lecture us and give us more information that we will be tested on. Also stop being so damn condescending to your students. It shows and we do not appreciate it. Stop being so pompous and snarky. No one cares if you try to foster relationships with your students, if you bring your academic smarters attitude into it. Lastly, if I'm trying to understand something and ask a question, I'm looking for a straightforward answer. Aka, what is gene flow? Tell me the dictionary definition and ask to see if I want more information. Do not cream your pants when I mention the word and then not even answer my damn question. I'm here for one simple thing, to do well on the tests. I'm premed and don't care about ecology. That's what I took 201 for. Instead of dumb course readings, let us see some case studies or experiments to understand this garbage. I know the feeling of being falsely accused by a student. I was tutoring for a Chinese family in their home. There was a 7-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy, and they liked to pick fights and such. So I tutored each individually in their rooms for about half an hour. Well, one day, when I showed up for tutoring, the little boy was being tutored first. I went into his room and the dad walked in too and sat on the bed. The parents were really hands off for the most part, leaving me to deal with their kids and obviously disliking it when I had to involve them when their child wasn't listening. So the dad says, "My son says you were in the closet trying to get into our safe." I was stunned. I had no idea there was a safe and had never been in the closet. The little boy had when he was being silly, but I'd never been in there myself. The dad said, "There's nothing in there except a few documents. I think about what has been thrown at me and the possible outcomes. How can I prove at all that I didn't?" So I just composed myself and looked him straight in the eye as I said, "I haven't tried to break into your safe. I didn't even know a safe was in there." The dad seemed to believe me, fortunately, but it really shook me up that an accusation by a student could land me in a lot of trouble. The dad verbally chastised the little boy for lying about that, and then we had tutoring like normal. The next time we had tutoring, and I went into the little boy's room, the little boy went into the closet. I began to approach the closet to get him out. He was being especially scarily. Door to the bedroom was open, by the way. The little girl puts her head in and says suspiciously, "What are you doing?" I could tell she meant the closet, and I was sick of this unwarranted suspicion. So I said, "That's it. We are only having lessons in your sister's room from now on." So I tutored both children in there from that time on, and didn't have to deal with the weirdness and suspicion of being in the other room. My wife was certified P12, special education with restraint training in the wonderful Commonwealth of Kentucky. She worked her first year as a kindergarten teacher in the Lexington School District, a job that she loved. Unfortunately, the district noticed that not only did she love her job, she A. gave a damn about her kids, and B. fought for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. She damn near went to fisticuffs with a parent a few different times, but that's another story for another day. At the end of her first year, the district leadership came to her and asked her to work at a juvenile lockdown center, which is when the fun and drama started. Her first week in school, they start pulling kids out of her class to the office until it's just her and one student. She looks at the kid and asks him point blank, "What did you do?" His response, "I robbed a store on the way to school." A few moments she had a dozen cops also in her classroom screaming at the student to get on the ground as they arrested him. My favorite incident was a few months later. In January, we were loafing around the house watching college basketball when we hear a knock at our door. My wife went to the door and shrieked and ran back to the back bathroom and locked herself in and started screaming, "There's a student at my house." On the phone, in a moment of testosterone fueled stupidity, vertical bar white knight thinking vertical bar goodness, ran, grabbed a shotgun, cracked open the door, and racked around in the shotgun. And very politely explained to this young man, who had his arms up over his head, that my wife did not have officers, and that neither he nor I wanted any trouble. Fast forward 90 seconds, and I've got a dozen Lexington police officers at my doorstep, guns drawn, telling the kid to get on his knees while they cuff him, and then discover a handgun in his waistband. TLDR, wife worked with a bunch of teenage thugs who wanted to kill her. I'm an elementary level teacher with time in grade 1, 3, and 5 along with currently being a reading specialist. I'd have to say that in all of my run-ins, the kids often come second in the worst experiences to their parents. Of course, I believe that kids are inherently good and are a product of their environment, so this may shape how I perceive a child's actions. One day during my administrative internship I was called in to help with a kindergarten student who has jumping on counters, throwing things at her teacher, running around the room screaming, and cursing at every attempt her elderly teacher made to stop the behavior. This was far from the first time this little girl had displayed a violent outburst. At my entrance she latched onto a pipe under the classroom sink and had to be pried off after numerous attempts at talking her out. She punched, kicked, headbutted and thrashed the whole way, but the counselor and I were able to get her to the hall. Here we allowed her the opportunity to walk on her own power, but simply slumped on the ground refusing to move. When I offered my hand to help her up I got a swift kick to the face that would have made Anderson Silva proud. We finally got her to the office where the principal told of how she couldn't be at school for the rest of the day and that her father would be called. Numerous attempts to contact her father were unsuccessful, so she spent the rest of the day in the office. Just before dismissal her father called back and came to pick her up. Having been drove home, she beat the bus with her sister on it home. The kids on the bus and the bus driver watched in dismay as the bus stopped to let the sister off, and the father dropped the child who was sent home's pants and lashed her with a belt right at the bus stop. He later said that he was showing her and the rest of the kids that her behavior was not going to be accepted. Of course a hotline call was made to Child Protective Services, which ultimately didn't yield a whole lot. A few days later it comes out through meeting with a CPS worker that she has been getting molested by her father including the night before her outburst. TLDR kindergarten girl has violent outburst in which I'm struck numerous times. Father beats the little girl with a belt in front of a whole bus. Little girl was getting sexually abused by her father causing the outbursts. I teach an elective class, German, at a Midwest high school. The students are generally very nice, but somehow this year one of my classes got filled with kids with really low reading scores. They have every right to take my class, but why counselors would suggest it is beyond me. The students in that class also have a lot of trust issues, calling me a liar when I tell them about life in other places, like Germany, where I've been 6 times and studied there. Needless to say, I don't always feel successful trying to teach them. Anyway, I assigned half of a worksheet one day, leaving the bottom half to complete at a later time. One kid asked me if they only had to do the top of the sheet, to which I replied yes, just the top was assigned. The kid next door then turns to him and says, no, we had to do the bottom, too, and sends him into a panic. Oh man, I'm not done. Shoot. I literally had just told him, as the teacher, that only the top was assigned, and he believed the asshole next to him over me. I went into a tirade to the whole class about how I had never witnessed anything so pathetic in my life. That if I had never seen anything so idiotic, and that I have never stood up and lied to any of them, nor would I, because I don't get paid for that I don't teach something and say gotcha at the end of the period, or type extra vocab sheets on the weekend for fun, or for my personal benefit. That if they would trust me as much as I trust them, I would save a hell of a lot of ink correcting their papers. I do regret making the class feel like idiots, but I have had much more respect since. Throw away because I don't want any of my friends figuring out what my actual Reddit account is. I went to a school in Florida that was known as being one of the worst in the entire state. Only a few public schools in some of the cities were as bad as this place. I've heard that it has gotten somewhat better since my 4 years there, but during that time it was absolutely goddamn nightmare. Since the amount of shit I saw happen is pretty long, I will just give a few highlights. If you want to hear more, just let me know, and I might consider explaining it further. I have pretty vivid memories of most of the insanity, so it will take a while. Obviously point not 1, but 2. Teachers getting fired for selling drugs to students. Not 1, but 2. Teachers getting fired for being drunk on the job. 1. Ending in a car accident in the school parking lot. Vast amounts of tagging and destruction of school property. A car being lit on fire. Several attempted school shootings. Several gang related incidents between Students and police. Over 50 students getting into a fight in the parking lot. Student arrested for trying to start a pot farm in the storage area. Repeated destruction. The boys' toilets. More fights than I can count. More pregnant girls fighting than I can count. More racism than you believe. Several of my classmates declaring they needed to go to the hospital because someone did something funny to their drugs. Several students leaving class streaking on LSD. Several teachers reprimanded for looking at porn instead of teaching. Watched my math teacher get locked in a bathroom by my class. Watched several students stealing purses and wallets from my teachers. Okay, I'm teaching a class of year 10s. I love this class, they are fun, and I've managed to get even the kids who previously got DS handing work and averaging a C1 lesson. One of the calls, call her Mindy, is screwing around with her friends and about to throw a ball of paper. Whenever possible I like to correct kids while being lighthearted and with a sense of humor. The problem gets solved quickly and kids get back to work. If I confront them more directly it often wastes class time in an argument. I walk up to her, snatch the ball from her hand, and while being 30 centimeters away I throw it at face and say, Mindy, get on with your work. The kid starts crying her eyes out and yelling. I invite her to the hallway to talk. She says she's really hurt by this. I tell her my reasoning and say she should go to the bathroom because her Mac-up is leaking and then go to the office and file a complaint about me because she feels this way. After I first call her mother. I explain what happened, and the mother seems okay, but she brings up this point. She says, I just left work early because my kid called me up and was crying so much I couldn't understand her. You sound reasonable, but I trust my kid and I want to hear her side. After she has calmed down, I says that sounds great, and then go to my principal what happened. She backs me up and even states she thought I did the right thing and would have done the same. Nothing ever happened. I talked to kid about later and told her I was sorry that I caused that reaction. I really was. I quite like that kid and the last I wanted was to see her cry and behaved in class. My guess is that the kid was probably going through something else and I just tipped the scales on a bad day. I only say this was the worst because it happened last year when I was in my first year of teaching and deep down I was terrified because I've never had a complaint against me. I was also going through some anxiety problems which have since been fixed, but the memory still scares me a little. I know it has been said over and over in this thread, but I would like to add my stories. When I was in college, getting my teaching degree, I worked at a YMCA in an aftercare. Eventually I was promoted to supervisor and was required to stay the summer and work as a camp supervisor/counselor. I was asked to be in charge of the counselor in training, SIT, camp. Now, to caveats, this age group was not my expertise. I was getting my P3 and K8 certifications and these kids were all 13 plus. Second, these kids were old enough to stay home by themselves, but their parents didn't trust them. They were all misfits, the worst of the worst. The kids liked me, but didn't like my rules or my way of doing things. I actually made them to camp. I kept them busy with activities and didn't allow them to make out with each other or curse. Eventually this one girl got tired of being made to participate, so she hatched a scheme. She and a friend went to my boss and said that I was hitting them. They had no evidence, but it was 2 against 1. I was pulled into the head boss's office and suspended so that they could investigate. Lucky for me the friend cracked and told them that it was all a lie. I got my job back and was switched to a younger group for the rest of the summer. I was very lucky. If this had gone further I could have lost my future in teaching. After I graduated I got a job in a head start/Abbott district preschool. These kids were all pretty poor and needed a lot of help, but they were preschoolers and we all very sweet. The problem there was the management. Let me preface this by saying that the school was in an old building and the children's bathrooms were outside of the classroom and the hallway. There was one bathroom for each gender, each having 3 stalls in it. About 4 weeks into the school year the management made a new rule. Children were not allowed to go into the hallway without a teacher. They also said that a teacher could not be left alone in the classroom with students. In each classroom there was a head teacher and an aide. So, if no teacher could be alone in the class with students, and no kid could be in the hallway without a teacher. That meant that if a kid had to go to the bathroom, the whole class had to go. This was awful. It took forever. You can't keep that many kids occupied in a hallway for that long. And preschoolers have not mastered the bladder control to go to the bathroom on any kind of set schedule. So here I am, in the hall with my aide multiple times a day, playing Simon Says, and any other game I can think of to keep the kids occupied, while everyone uses the bathroom. This lasts for a while, but finally the kids have had it, and so have I. They start to misbehave. They want to run in the hall excreta. So what happens? My idiotic boss, that was never a teacher and made up the stupid rule in the first place, writes me up and threatens suspension for not being able to control my class. I have no idea what I was supposed to do in this situation. It is simply impossible to control 23-year-old kids in a hallway for 30-minute clips, multiple times a day. You can color, Simon Says, I Spy, and count all you want to, but it doesn't work. I kept teaching for a few more years, but it wasn't worth it. As a teacher you have to fight too many battles. Actually educating is barely even on the to-do list. I work in hours now. I earn more money and work a ton less hours. I'm home for my kids in the afternoon, and I can assure you that if they don't understand what they are learning in school, I make sure that they do before they leave the homework table. This happened back when I was in 7th grade. Lunch had just ended and me and a friend ran to the BO room because some people in previous hours had let us know that midterm grades were up. At that school, each student was assigned an ID number, and test scores would be displayed on a sheet of paper with the scores next to our designated IDs. So when me and my friend got in the room, there was already a crowd of about 5 to 10 kids around the sheet. When we finally got past the crowd, we scanned the paper looking for our scores. My friend was looking at the sheet, and I was jumping up and down excitedly for my turn. He scans the paper, pauses for a moment with a shocked look on his face, and then his eyes suddenly light up. He laughs and says out loud something like, "For a moment I thought I got a 24%. Looked at the wrong ID. Must have been some other retarded loser." Suddenly, some kid runs through the 5 to 10 people, literally knocking all of them away, and drives his elbow into my friend's neck right below the ears. My friend falls forward and smashes his face into the wall that the paper was taped on. He then drops down onto the ground, landing on his forehead first, and I remember seeing the concrete wall stained and dripping with blood, and how horrified I was. A small puddle of blood was around his head, and there was blood coming out of one of his ears. The asshole who drove my friend into the wall ran out of the room like the little sheet who grew legs. There was a teacher in the room at the time, and he shouted for everyone else to leave the room. The kid was arrested or something. I really don't give a fuck where he went. My friend had a concussion and had problems with his third vertebrae after being rushed to the ER. I lost touch with him and never saw him again. My high school had to phase out German classes because the students treated the teacher like filth. This went on my freshman, sophomore, and junior years, and probably before that. She wasn't a very pleasant person, but they treated her worse than I thought anyone could treat a human being. They would chuck batteries at her head and fly paper airplanes into her hair. Once they had her cowering in a corner and they were licking gummy bears and sticking them to her face. A couple times they threw her expensive smartboard markers out the window onto the roof. I remember one time she left the room and a student opened a window, then hid under a desk. When she came back, they all told her he jumped out the window. Frantically, she ran out of the room to get help, and when she came back he was sitting in his desk and everyone acted like nothing had happened. She would call security and other teachers and the principals all the time, and eventually they stopped coming. They grew weed in one of her potted plants for a while. There was one girl that was in her class my sophomore year. At the beginning of the year she was the quietest, shyest girl ever. By the end of the year she was cursing out the teacher along with everyone else. There were rumors that she had put security cameras in the classroom that had a live feed to the principal's office, but these were proven to be false. I wondered how that woman could get out of bed every day and still come in and try and teach. The class was completely out of control. Then she quit or was fired. I don't know, but they couldn't find anyone to take the job, so German was phased out of the school completely. TLDR, Students at my school bullied the German teacher so viciously, like throwing things at her, growing weed in the classroom, causing panic, etc., that she left the school. They couldn't find anyone to take the job, and the class was phased out completely. Was in elementary school, forgot what grade, and there was this one particular kid who was a complete nutjob. He would throw rage fits, like they were sheet, and he were a monkey, oftentimes, for no good apparent reason. And he didn't come from a bad neighborhood, but his mother was not the brightest crayon in the box. The kid had ADD, and instead of ever giving him any help, she would just pump him full of pill that never did anything. And when teachers tried to get him moved to a special class, elementary school is ruthless. Those kids don't give a fuck. They will make your life miserable if you're weird, where he wouldn't be as much of a problem and he wouldn't be bothered by the other kids. His mother would threaten with a lawsuit and spin some crazy logic magic on the system. Anyway, one day, the kid is in class, and something happens to set him off, and a few chairs/desks get thrown around. Some things were said, and a book was thrown at the pregnant teacher and the kid tried beating her. As far as I know, the teacher and baby were fine. The kid didn't get in trouble, because he is in that situation, where he gets treated like a mentally handicapped victim, when the blame is on him, and is a perfectly able-bodied, normal kid when people try to get the right accommodations for him. TLD, a messed up kid has fit in class, throws sheet around, beats teacher, and is not punished, because he is considered mental. But only when his mother wants him to be. I'm a student, but I've got an interesting story to share. When I was in 2nd grade, I had the most evil, bitch of a teacher that I have ever come across. She hated me, I don't know why. She did everything possible to trip me up. I would turn in assignments and she would throw them away in front of me and say that I never did them. The problem was that I had no proof. She was always very supportive of me in the parent-teacher meetings, saying how if I just showed a little effort I could improve. For the first half of the year I was grounded, because I was literally getting a check minus, basically a 0% in my school in 2nd grade, for everything. Then one day, I decided to wait to turn in my assignment, until my mom came, and got me from school. I turned it into my teacher and she threw it into the trash about 5 seconds before my mom walked in. When she did, I showed my mom and after that, things changed. My mom basically made the school board her beach, and I got a perfect score for the year, because my mom threatened to sue. Then a few years later in high school, my sophomore year, I had what I can only be described as the most amazing teacher I have ever had. She was young, almost looked like a student, but she was brilliant. The work she had us do never seemed like work at all, and she was the nicest woman I have ever met. To this day. One day, her boyfriend, who was a substitute, came in for her on a day she had to take off. Her friend died. He asked us if we minded helping him propose in a few weeks. None of us did, or so I thought, and when that day rolled around, we did the big cheesy banda thing, and she said yes. She looked like she had never been happier. The next day, we had a substitute, not her boyfriend, and when we asked the VP what was wrong, he said that apparently one of the kids, one of the very few people who were actually failing her class, had reported her for using class time for personal things, and she had been fired. One kid who was getting a bad grade managed to get what was probably the best teacher that school had ever had fired. And my evil beach of a 2nd grade teacher, who got an award for lifetime teaching achievements or something a year later, had a perfect record. I really want to beat both my 2nd grade teacher and that kid who got Mizutoko fired, until they are bleeding from every orifice. I'm a teacher at a JHS in Japan and I have a lot of crazy stories, but in particular I have one very difficult 9th grade student who is always causing trouble. He constantly hassles the main teacher, and when she is near their desks and not looking, he and his friend stand up and simulate humping her as everyone else laughs. Another student, 8th grade, has his desk close to where I stand in the entire class. He is just muttering "die beach" in Japanese under his breath at the main teacher. So, maybe the worst thing the 9th grade kid did was one day when he and some of his friends were talking to me and he started asking me specifically where my house was and what apartment number. All the kids know where I live since it is very close to the school. Anyways, I told him I certainly wasn't telling him where I live. We always kind of joke back and forth, but he is the closest to dangerous of all the kids I teach, and he got a little annoyed at my reluctance and turned to his friends and said, surprisingly in English, "Hey guys, let's go rap-a-kick at her house." Rather taken aback at his ballsiness, I just shouted, "What did you just say?" And he started gleefully laughing and ran off. He also constantly asks me if I'm a virgin, talks about his penis being small, and pretends to punch me in the face to make me flinch. I never do. In addition, they make sexual nicknames for me and spread them around, and one kid told me it's his mission to get me to kiss him before graduation. Well, I was teaching at an elementary school for a while until the superintendent in a neighboring district came to visit me and asked me to take over the principal position at a nearby high school. I wanted that job a very long time ago, but they wouldn't give it to me. It was full of gangsters now and no one had any control of the kids there. They just passed them, so they wouldn't have to deal with them anymore. Now they wanted me to come in and save the school so some politician could get re-elected. The first week I was there, I had all of the biggest troublemakers come on stage in the auditorium, and in front of the entire school I expelled every single one of them. Those kids did not like me after that, but it was something I had to do to save the future education of the students that actually cared. One of them ended up getting back into the school. He had drugs, weapons, etc. I've never been scared for my life. But when you look an actual armed gang banger in the face while he is threatening you with threats that could easily happen in his hands, well, that rattles you. But I had that beach tossed out and cleaned up the whole school, proceeded to have some of the best grades in the state, and the majority of the students exceeded the average score on the mandatory state exams. And believe it or not, the parents of those kids that I expelled, they tried to get me fired. I even got put in a jail cell for a while for locking the doors to the school to keep those gang bangers out of it. Alright, here's a story from a privately segregated county in North Carolina. To this day, there's still a black high school and a white high school, and due to their little loophole this is still legitimate. I was a mixed race kid, appear white on the outside, so that's what I'm considered there. At the black high school, one day my biology teacher came into class with blood on his nice dress shirt. My bio teacher was also a football coach and Iraq war veteran, quite a fit guy. His name is Coach S'more. There are gangs there. One day, a single kid who's a Crip, let's call him Brent, ends up being the last to leave a classroom. Except he doesn't leave. 4 Bloods enter as he's about to get out. One of them barricades and blocks off the door. The other 3 begin to beat down Brent like he's a dirty rug and the maid's having a bad day. They beat him so bad he's practically unconscious in the middle of the class. When kids outside the room notice what's going on due to windows, a crowd gathers in the hallways and kids are screaming and hollering. Coach Hoffler, who is a big man, bigger than Coach S'more, begins to run towards that classroom. Coach Hoffler is a guy who's so big, his head looks like a peanut sitting on top of a pumpkin. He's about 6 feet 8, 6 minutes and 10 seconds and easily 280 to 350 of mostly muscle. The one kid who was watching the door sees Coach Hoffler coming. Suddenly, there's 3 Bloods holding the door, while one continues to beat the Crip kid, and Coach Hoffler is beating down that door like Donkey Kong with a barrel. Coach Hoffler is being held back by these gang punks. As Coach S'more arrives, Coach Hoffler and Coach S'more break into the room. The door had to be replaced. Coach Hoffler takes 2 of them up in his arms and personally escorts them far away. Coach S'more takes the other 2 off of the Crip, while the school security officer shows up and begins to take care of business. 10 minutes later I stroll into biology and Coach S'more enters class with blood on his shirt. Vertical bar fact, that school. Junior year of high school, we had a new Spanish teacher. This woman barely spoke English, and it was a wonder to me how she ever got hired. After several conflicts between her and the class, a few of us went to the department head, and after he evaluated her in the classroom for a week, she was fired. She was replaced by a recent college graduate. This woman must have been 25, tops. We were a bunch of rowdy, 17-year-olds, so there wasn't much of an age gap. She could have been someone's big sister. After getting one teacher fired that year, we all must have had the mentality that we had all of the power. We were terrible to begin with, but some of the pranks we pulled in that class were occasions I deem to be the funniest moments of my life. To date. A second day there, one of my classmates' friends was passing in the hall and decided to walk in and sit down to have a chat with his friend. When the teacher noticed she suddenly gained a pupil, she asked for his name to mark him in on attendance. Like a hive mind, we all whispered to him the name of a student who had been sick all week and the teacher had yet to meet. He took on the kid's identity for about half of the class before getting called out for talking obnoxiously. He and the teacher got into an argument before he stormed out of the room. The teacher called down to the main office to have one of the security guards locate him and give him detention, but she addressed him by the absent student's name. Not too long after my teacher made the call in the first place, she received a call from the office telling her that the student whom she reported was not in school that day. Confused, she asked us who he really was, to which we all responded uniquely and at once, "I don't know, I thought he was a teacher, I've never even seen him before today, he doesn't even go here," etc. On another occasion, one of my classmates brought a water balloon to class. There had just been a riot in the cafeteria and some of the kids thought it would be funny to incite a food fight by starting with water balloons. Having one of the remnants of the incident, he prepared to launch it at the blackboard while the teacher had her back turned, but it slipped from his hand and into the lighting units that hung from the ceiling. In unison, we all started clamoring about how we could not continue with class until we turned the lights off, for fear of the balloon popping and the water electrocuting everyone. When the lights were turned off, we all complained that it was too dark to see the board. Checkmate. One student would occasionally make paper airplanes and pass it to his friend sitting across the room. We would see how long we could keep it going within the whole class before the teacher caught on. One day, that student tore a piece of paper off of an easel from the architecture classrooms and brought it to class in the form of a giant airplane. On one flight, the teacher turned around sooner than we thought she would. I remember seeing everyone correct their posture and direct their attention to the front of the room as she turned to face the class. I can only imagine what must have gone through her head to see a normally dysfunctional class sitting orderly while a giant paper airplane across the classroom. The incident, which I deem to be the funniest moment of my life, occurred right around final exam time. Our teacher thought it would be a good way for us to learn the vocabulary if we played charades in class. In small groups, we were assigned several action verbs and had to come into class prepared to act them out for the class to guess. One group was conveniently composed of the class clowns. Their idea was to have one musically talented member play the guitar to serve as narration, while someone else from the class acted out one of the group's words. One kid in the class volunteered to go first. He got a gera or cogga run arabita, which means to throw a tantrum. I remember hearing him ask the class who wants to get their ass kicked before being drowned out by the loud grunge music that came out of the amp the group had brought. The actor proceeded to leap onto a desk and hop around the room from desk to desk screaming like a rhesus monkey. He stopped on a desk of one of his best friends and started to open palm slap his head, pull his hair, scream in his face, etc. I wasn't an active part in this, but I was present during all of it. So sophomore year of high school in my social studies class, we had this amazing teacher who was fun and made us really want to learn about economics, history and whatever other random sheet fell under the social studies umbrella. Come second semester, he leaves to realize his dream of being a firefighter. We were also happy for him, but we were sad to see him go. In his replacement, we got this 30-year-old lady who seemed fairly nice. People automatically hated her. No real reason, but my entire class was determined to get rid of her. It started small, changing names, writing stupid things on the board, etc. But it quickly escalated. That year we had just gotten new smartboards in all our classrooms, so the pens for that quickly went missing, and she held out class until someone told her where they went. No one said anything. Soon the students would start belittling her and calling her out in class. I honestly lost track of how many times my classmates made her cry. To top it all off, slowly they began to build a gigantic spitball right above her desk. I really do mean gigantic. Think of a soccer ball cut in half. That's what it looked like as it dangled from the ceiling. When it finally fell, she wasn't there, but she lost it. Our entire class got in trouble. We got several talking to, but really nothing ever came of it. When the year ended, we never saw her again. That was the first time I realized how mean people can be. We only disliked her because she replaced our original teacher. That's it. I really feel sorry, and I hate myself for not doing anything. I could tell you many things, but I really don't have an excuse for what happened. I used to work at a high school doing it work, but my home base was a computer lab. Teachers would sign up for time in the lab, and I'd often get an interesting perspective on both teachers and students. One year, there was a leave replacement hired just a week before the start of the school year for a class that regularly spent lots of time in the lab researching. I could go on about the utter pointlessness of the class, but that's not the point. This teacher was a fairly nice guy. He was tall, had dark hair, a crew cut, and kind of a serious look about him. Based on looks and attitude, you probably wouldn't think to mess with this guy. Unfortunately, he had a kind of high-pitched voice, and it would get higher as he would get more rattled. There was one student in his section who would basically torment this poor fellow. I don't know exactly how it started, but eventually the student would start a slow clap while chanting the teacher's last name, usually after he did something awkward or goofy, like drop his pencil or misspeak. The whole class would join in on it. I won't lie, I found it hilarious. But I can't let on point this one student was really just a class clown, not malicious or vindictive. I think he just saw a situation where he could create a stage for himself as a comedian, and after a while there was no situation that he couldn't turn into a source of hilarity. This teacher maybe didn't have the best skills in terms of classroom control to start with, but somehow this one student was exposing his inability for everyone to see. I can't count the number of times I had to get out of the room so that I could actually laugh about the situation without being seen by the students or teacher. This student eventually found out that he had one of his free periods was during the other section of the class. So, he'd come in and basically retrieve the material from earlier in the day. Anyway, this progressed from September through December. When we came back from the holiday break, a new leave replacement had been hired. I felt really bad for this poor teacher. He didn't necessarily deserve this treatment. But I also think that this may have been the kick in the ears he needed to get better with managing a classroom. He was either going to get better or decide to stop teaching. Walking down the death trap stairs of the science block at my first school during the always deadly morning lesson change. Most lesson changes are deadly at an all-boys school. As per usual on a Tuesday morning, most of year 10th, 14 over 15 years old, is traveling from science to a variety of equally disliked lessons on the other side of the school. With the management clamping down on lateness to lessons, these guys are in a rush. One particularly brutish rugby playing dickwood decides that his punctuality is more important than life itself, and decides that we could all move faster. He starts throwing his weight around, and of course the pack mentality takes over, creating a marauding army of self-entitled douchebags intent on getting everybody to the ground floor as quickly and uncomfortably as possible. I get a nice hard shove into the handrail that separates the crowd from a 2-floor drop point. Whilst I didn't fall, I did suffer to cracked ribs. Nobody stopped to help. Those who could be bothered to so much as glance over either didn't care or found it funny. I'd been spat at, kicked and bitten before. I'd had glassware launched at me, seen stools used as weapons in fights, and sat in our department office as a kid tried to set the school alight, and no alarms went off. I'd put up with those things, almost let them go completely, but to be unable to sense a shred of decency in any of those kids was the end of the road. I now work at a far better school just 5 minutes down the road. All's well that ends well, eh? My school just got a group of kids that are supposed to be in special classrooms for emotionally disturbed children, but their program got shut down, so they are just in regular classrooms. Here's some highlights from the year. A student told a teacher, whose mom had just died a few days ago, that she's a fat bitch and her mom died because she got tired of looking at her. A different student got a toy taken away by the science teacher and he flipped out and tried to hit her. She tried to restrain him, but he bit her so hard she had to get a tetanus shot. Another student systematically went through the room and punched every kid in the face. He's bigger than his teacher, so she couldn't really do anything to stop him, and our crisis team, the people who come to restrain kids when they do stuff like this, didn't make it up to the room on time. He then went and tore a bulletin board out of the wall. This same student got into a fight on the bus before school, then came in and tried to punch another student. When that kid punched him back, shocker, he tried to run out of the school. The principal tried to stop him, but he pushed her into the wall and then went tearing down the street. Lucky for us, a cop, who sits there every morning to give people tickets for driving the wrong way, stopped him and brought him back to the school. I work at an elementary school. These students range from 2nd grade, the biter, to 5th grade, the puncher. Not a teacher myself, but few of my favorite student/teacher stories from when I attended high school are as follows. In my final high school year, during a physics lesson, one of the more stupid troublemakers decided to come into the class completely stoned. The idiot strolled in around 10 minutes late and decided to spend the remainder of the class shouting oxymoron at everyone and everything, as he has just heard this word and believes it's an educated insult. It has the word moron in it. After shouting oxymoron at the wall for 5 minutes, he finally decides to ask the teacher what the word means. The teacher, being the awesome, calm teacher he is, decides to educate the idiot instead of sending him out. His explanation, as a highly British bloke, is as follows: an oxymoron is something that isn't, for example, American intelligence. Of course this just confused the pothead more. My other story happened in the same science room, but with a different teacher. The previous year, our teacher was explaining pressure to us and bending a wooden meter stick to visually explain what he was talking about. The class was huddled quite close around him so that we could hear, and a kid in the front row was almost stabbed as the stick snapped unexpectedly and a 30 centimeters, guessing, shard was catapulted out of the middle. It missed him narrowly, and I've heard that the teacher doesn't do that experiment anymore. When I was in 3rd grade, my family moved to the middle of nowhere because my dad's office had transferred him. My family had the choice of putting me in the public school or a private school. According to my mom, who has been an elementary and special education teacher for years, the public school was a waste of time and tax dollars. It was so bad. So, here I am, the genius of this little private Christian school. Their label, not mine. The 3rd grade curriculum was literally the exact same of my previous school's 2nd grade, save the Bible study class. Well, enter Bible study class. My teacher asks the students who here has been saved. Every student raises their hand. Every student but me. I was a 3rd grader, and I had no idea what she was talking about when she said saved. I gave everyone a quizzical look as I turned this problem over and over in my head, trying to figure out what she meant. Before I could come up with a logical conclusion though, she gives me the meanest look she could muster and exclaims, rather loudly, "You are going to hell. You hear me? You are going to hell." I had a basic concept of hell from my Sunday school back home, and to me, it was the bad place that bad people go to when they die. Needless to say, I burst into tears and leave the class. Later that night, at home, my mom asks me why I'm so down. I hadn't cried at home or told her what had happened, so I told her and had another crying spell. I even asked her, "Am I going to hell, Mom?" Of course this turned on the wet works for her too, and she simply responded, "No, honey, you aren't." She doesn't know what she's talking about. I asked, "But what if I don't believe everything she or the preacher says? Will I go to hell then?" She responded, "No, you won't. You can believe or not believe anything you want to, and nobody can make you think any differently." Everything went but at an expected point. JPG. I'm a teacher. I teach dual credit biology with the local college to 11th grade juniors. I'm also at a school, which is an early college high school. I have 1.5 years experience teaching public school. I also have 3 years teaching at the local university. I really don't have much to say regarding bad students. In all honesty, my kids are very good. The school we have has taught them well. But my issue comes with the lack of respect the education system has for producing truly motivated and independent students. Here is how it goes. There are a bunch of high schools around. However, here, everybody and their mother wants to be early college high school. These schools are blends of college and high school, hence the name. Students typically get college credits and lower level courses, such as college algebra, music appreciation, English 1, 2, and 3, and of course, my class biology. The students gain these credits by one of two ways. 1. A professor from the local college visits maybe on Monday and Wednesday and lectures, or 2. The district hires a qualified teacher, who happens to have a master's degree, to teach the dual credit course for the college. I'm the dual credit teacher. We are a mix of both professor and teacher. 99% of my salary comes from the district, and 1% comes from the college. I don't have to deal with some issues real teachers have to deal with. I have less students, I don't have to administer yearly tests, and typically the administrators leave me alone. It's a fine balance, because I offer something unique, because of my master's in biology. I'm not tooting my own horn here, I mean really, in this region, hardly anyone has a master's degree or one in biology for that matter. However, as I teach these students, I'm supposed to replicate the college environment. This is not happening. You cannot force a young 17 years old to visualize college in the setting of a high school. The public school system is held back drastically because of whining kids and parents, progress reports, field trips, UIL, and of course, no accountability. I've learned quite a bit in the year and a half I've been there. My ultimate goal is simply to turn these children into young adults. That's it. I really hope they grow to love science as well, but maturity needs to come first. Next, I hope I challenge them to expect more from themselves and the world. So, what's the whole point of this? It's that many students are victims to the stupidity of adults in education. Ridiculous rules are set up to make everyone happy. But in the end, the loser is the students, who will inadvertently teach in the system and maintain the status quo. I hope to be the teacher who changes those few students who may change the world. Those are my 2 cents. Too many stories in here, so I'll probably get to it later. I think there might be stories in here about me if my teachers come on Reddit. During elementary and high school I was that little sheethead kid that was the worst for any teacher. I was pretty good at being the psycho sheethead that I was able to rile up the other kids for no reason and just cause trouble. Thinking about what I did, I'm surprised I did not get expelled, and the most surprising thing is the principal mostly sided with me. Here's a story from 7th grade. When it happened I thought the teacher was being an asshole. Thinking back I'm pretty sure we are both at fault. I was at school after hours because the school had just started this SAT prep thing to see if we would be able to learn the material required to pass the SAT even in 7th grade. They picked the top 15 kids in the school based on standardized test scores or some bullshit. I know it wasn't GPA because my GPA was low as hell, so the gates to leave the school was closed. This is where the shit hit the fan for no reason. I saw a teacher that I didn't know and I asked him if he could open the gate. He responded no, so I told him okay and that I was going to just enter the office and exit through the front door. He got mad at this for some reason. I'll never know because he never told me. He told me to go to the back of the school, exit there and walk around the school. Basically I'd have to walk like 500 yards instead of 50 feet. I didn't want to deal with his bullshit, so I did what he told me to. When I finally get back to the front of the school he rushes me from the office yelling at me asking me what's your name. At this point I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. It was after school hours and I wasn't on school property, so I told him to go fuck himself. He got really mad and took a step towards me. I jumped back and told him to back the fuck up or I was going to kick the shit out of him. I was pretty tall for my age, and considering he was an immigrant he was pretty damn short. I was taller than him probably by 3 inches. I had trained in TKD, so I was super confident I would fuck him up. Principal comes out and tells him to leave me alone because if he didn't the principal wasn't going to stop me from kicking his ass. The next day he tries to apologize to me and I told him to go fuck himself again for wasting my time. He went to cry to the principal, so the principal talked to me about it. I told him I didn't want this guy talking to me ever again, and if he did I'm just going to tell him to go fuck himself. This definitely isn't the worst thing that I've done. This is just one where I can sort of justify my actions. I'm not a teacher. At my secondary school, high school in England, we had a supply teacher who was hard of hearing. People used to put their mobile phones playing music under his chair and he would, "Whose phone is that?" They also used to play a game where you won by shouting a swear word the loudest, and he often didn't hear, or feigned ignorance. One of our religious education teachers was asthmatic, though she smoked and complained about it a lot. So one day somebody brought some aftershave into the classroom, and when she was outside ran around spraying it everywhere, and she refused to come back into the classroom after her eyes started watering. All that said, she wasn't the nicest teacher ever. What takes the cake was a student teacher we had in maths. Every class we were supposed to do 10 questions at the start to get our minds working, or some crap like that, and the majority of time we were there we managed to do almost no work by stretching out the 10 questions across the entire lesson, because she had no control at all over the class. She had a slight lisp and slightly over large front teeth, and one day during 10 questions she asked a question about trees which she sounded as cheese, and from that day forth she was known as Ratty. It became so farcical that we used to play games with her. For example, trying to get everyone's name written on the board. 2 warnings and you get a detention. Even the kids who hardly ever got them. Hi. In fact, it got so bad that she brought in a tape recorder to try and prove to our actual teacher how bad we were, which just resulted in people shouting at the tape recorder before someone just stopped the recording when she wasn't looking. After that, our actual teacher sat in and watched every lesson point. Not exactly horror stories, but kind of cruel nonetheless. I'm not a teacher, I'm an 8th grader, but I have been forced to defuse many situations. Some of them hilarious, and some unforgettable. Here is one of them. Well, I'm at a pretty shitty middle school, the kind of school you need an officer for. There was this crazy motherfucker who bought razors and needles and stuff to school, but I never told on him because he'd slit my throat or something. This guy was named Bob. I shit you not, he was named Bob. He trusted me with everything, but I'm digressing. It was the middle of lunch and Bob was messing with someone, so a teacher had to come in. He punches her in the face and then starts punching everyone. Not even school security with a big fat white guy, a tall army black guy, and a tall big fat black guy could get this guy off. The testosterone was a rollin'. So the cop comes in, whips out his taser, and tases him right there. I'm right next to him, and he's spazzing, and all sorts of crazy stuff right there on the ground. I still go to this school and he never came back, but there was a new guy who looked exactly like him, and he got so much heat for looking like Bob, and being called Bob he had to transfer out. I surprisingly have more. Here's another story. I was in 5th grade and there was this douchey kid named Brandon who never wanted to do anything. He always was a pure shit to anyone and everyone, but later did I find out he had reasons for this, bless his soul. But anyways, we had a substitute named Mr. P, and he was a pretty calm guy. Brandon was just the rudest person to him this day. He gave this man the shit of his actual life, and just so disgusting to him. Brandon probably had a shitty day, because all of a sudden he starts hitting him, and Mr. P had to get him off him. Due to the laws in my state, teachers get one self-defense punch back, and Mr. P punched him off in the hardest manner possible, like I don't even. Mr. P was welcome back. Not a teacher, but I'll share this story from the perspective of a student point. So I attended high school in New York City at one of those new small high schools that Bloomberg heralded. The one that I went to ended up being the mayor's poster boy for small schools like a year after I graduated. The thing about these small schools are that the city doesn't really want to invest too much money into them, so most of the teachers are younger with recent certs or part of the Teaching Fellows program. As a result, they usually end up with the same problems as regular high schools: limited funding, ridiculous overcrowding, behavioral problems, just a balkanized version of those problems, since the small schools would often share space with like 2 or 3 other schools. So, this teacher was part of the New York City Teaching Fellows. Nice lady, dreams of teaching, had apparently came from being an actor on Broadway. I suspect that things didn't work out for her there, but I can't be sure. She starts the year extremely chipper, with lots of young minds to inspire and whatnot. Problem: there's a segment of the class, let's say about 7 out of 32, that just ain't down for that sheet. Each and every class session comes with a barrage of insults and personal attacks from this segment of the class. Constantly this woman would break down in the middle of a class, and it would be over. This turned out to be the worst thing that she could have done, since she now gave the kids who didn't want to be at school at all an easy button to shut down class whenever they felt like it. This continued for about half of the school year. Finally one day she comes in, clearly disillusioned with the prospects of teaching. Emotionally defeated, she doesn't bother to teach the class anymore. She plays this aft while we teach speech on the computer, gives a statement of resolve and sits quietly for the rest of the period. A few weeks later she quits. I'm not a teacher, but I volunteered with a youth court when I was a teenager and therefore got to see a lot of kids behaving badly. We handled real misdemeanor criminal cases involving, mostly, first-time offenders with teenagers serving as lawyers and judges. A real lawyer was normally in the courtroom as a legal advisor, but they were usually pretty hands-off, unless someone asked them a direct question. My preferred role most of the time was prosecutor. The majority of the cases were shoplifting. Other common cases were drug possession, vandalism, and assault. Being one of the most experienced prosecutors at the time, I tended to get a lot of the tougher cases, often paired with someone new to help them get up to speed. What follows isn't necessarily the worst thing I saw, but it's the one that stuck with me. The case one that really got to me was a fight in school between two girls, K and J. When boys fought, it was usually some sort of matter of honor, where they'd let up once dominance was established. Girls tried to destroy each other. It was never clear to me what the underlying dispute was about. I did a lot of research, but all I could ever come up with was supporters of each saying that the other was totally irrational and unpredictable. I think the trigger for the fight was some clothes belonging to one being in the other's possession for too long or something equally trivial. The incident, J's version was that K just came up and attacked her without provocation, knocked her down and repeatedly punched her while she was down. If J touched K at all, it was just in an attempt to shield herself from the blows. K's version was that J attacked her and she defended herself. J's injuries, the account of the two teachers who broke it up, and some other details that are a bit hazy 13 years later supported J's version. K was referred to youth court to be charged with assault. She pleaded not guilty, claiming self-defense. The trial, it was a good trial in the sense of being challenging and well executed by all involved. It ended in a hung jury. While discussing a possible retrial, K, J and K's father became agitated and left the courtroom. I asked the judge for a recess and helped escort them out of the building. Because of some difficulty I don't quite remember with courthouse security, I couldn't leave the building and get back in, so I didn't see what happened outside. From what security and the police said, K's father actively encouraged her to attack J in the parking lot, which she did. Someone else pulled her off, and the police showed up almost immediately. The case was sent back to social services with a recommendation for formal criminal charges. I never heard from K or J again, and don't know what the eventual resolution of the situation was. The aftermath. You thought it's over? Nope, there's more bad behavior to come. Several people on the jury were in training to be the next batch of volunteers. Several others were using the trial as community service that they had been sentenced to in their own youth court cases. Two were people I prosecuted. About a year later, my partner on a random case tells me she was on that jury and thought I needed to know about misconduct by other jurors. One of the standard questions asked of jurors was, do you know any of list of people involved in the case? With the exception of the jurors I had previously prosecuted who obviously knew me from that, everyone said no. Turns out, that wasn't quite true. Two of the jurors, who had become youth court volunteers, since actually did know K, and refused to vote to convict. Everybody else, including the two I prosecuted previously, who I could have removed from the jury for that reason, voted guilty. Given that she wasn't supposed to be telling me this, there wasn't much I could do about it. I did quietly make several people in leadership positions aware of what had happened. None of this dampened my enthusiasm for the program, but it did increase my misanthropy a bit. I'm a substitute teacher and I've been doing it now for about 4 months. I was so fucking stupid when I started. I went in thinking, oh, it's going to be awesome. I'm going to get to play with little kids and bond with teenagers and give them life lessons. Nope. I usually work about 3 days a week, and in 4 months at 3 days a week it's almost given me a nervous breakdown. This is some of the stuff I've seen, so I started with little kids thinking it would be fun. The really little ones, like kindergarten, poop and pee themselves a lot. They also cry and throw temper tantrums by throwing themselves on the floor. This stuff goes on all day. These things are definitely not the roughest in the world, but still kind of hard to deal with when it's 25 in a class and they are totally freaked because their regular teacher isn't there 2. So then I tried 3rd grade. None of them would do their work when I asked. I would try and be friendly, but firm and fair, but because there was 5 or 6 that were completely out of control, they spread it to the rest of the class. One of the little boys told one of the little girls that he was going to rap her, 3rd graders. Then at recess one of the boys kicked another little boy in the mouth so hard he started to bleed. Again, what the fuck, 3rd graders in a violent fight. 3. High school. I tried next, thinking they were basically adults and I could relate to them in a different, more mature way. I start the class off with, okay guys, take a seat real quick please, so I can take attendance. Nothing. I wait a minute to see if they will settle in. Nope. Okay, listen up. I need to take attendance, and then you guys have an assignment that's due at the end of class for a grade, so sit down. Nothing. There are about 35 kids in his class and they came in and were literally all out of their seats listening to music, throwing trash and then just walking out of the room. This is pretty much how it went for the rest of the day. Every class had 35 to 40 kids in it, and I almost never had any kind of quiet or order. One of the biggest problems was that in my orientation they basically told us that we are really discouraged from calling the assistant principal or principal for help. Basically, unless the cops needed to be called, just deal with whatever is going on. So in these crazy high school classes, where the kids knew I had no power, they just did whatever they wanted. I took the high school job pretty close to when I first started, so I was really reluctant to call, because I needed the job, but since then I have gotten over that, and don't really give a shit if it inconveniences them, because sometimes I need faking help. The one high school class that I finally did get under some control turned out to be the worst one. I had them at least sitting if not quiet, and every time I turned my back they would make a fart noise. I know, hilarious, but seriously it's kinda humiliating when it's over and over again in front of 35 teenagers. Then a chick in the front points at me and starts laughing hysterically, whispering to her friend and asking where I shop. Eventually I just sit down again and let them do whatever the hell they want. While I sit there I hear an entire conversation between about 5 kids on whether or not their parents were bigger than them and if they could beat their parents up. One kid said that his grandmother used to try and discipline him, but she tried now he would just punch her in the face. Another girl said that she had to slap her mom for trying to make her stay in her room and do work. At this point one of the students gets up and starts to walk to the door, apparently to just leave, when another kid tells him not to be in his hole and walk out. Fist kid turns around and punches the second kid in the face. Fight ensues. I rush over to break it up, and the first kid punches me in the back, although I think this may have been a mistake. I run out of the room, where I just saw a coach standing, tell to come in, and that there is a fight. He and another male teacher drag the 2 students out. 20 minutes later, the next passing period, there goes the violent kid walking down the hall like nothing happened. I finish up the day. At no point during the day does anyone from the administration come and ask me what happened or how it escalated, so at the end of the day I go by the front office and tell them about the fight and ask if anyone wanted to know what had happened. If we want information from you, we will ask for it. Oh god, I think I might be stupid about this whole teaching thing. Another high school job I get assigned is in ICE. In school suspension, there was a regular teacher, me and another sub. The other sub was a little older. The boys in there, no less than 1/2 hour into the day, started calling her fat, telling her she was an old beach and a hoe. She looked at the regular teacher and asked her if there was anything they could do about them speaking to her like that, and the woman told her to just ignore them. We went to lunch, and the older sub never came back. 5. Middle school is where I take most of my classes now. Even though it totally sucks, sometimes they have self-control and listen, usually not. Just the other day I was starting a middle school class, and one of the first things I usually say, because the classes always start out with a kid screaming a million questions and saying a million things, is, okay, listen, if you guys have a question, or need something, or just want to say something, please raise your hand. This should not, and usually does not, inspire hate. But that day, after I asked that question, one of the boys just straight up turned his head and said beach. I was actually totally shocked. I looked at him and asked, with no anger, but only real curiosity, did you think I couldn't hear you when you said that? He started to say something about how he thought I was being rude, and I immediately realized I wasn't going to have a converse day in with this kid about it, so I just called the principal and had him come get him out of the room. There's really a ton of other similar stories, but I just can't write anymore right now. I would sum it up though as really being a mixture of two problems. The first is that I'm a sub. I'm not going to have a positive relationship or effect on a kid if I work at his school for a day. Also, being a sub, I don't have any power. That brings me to the second problem, which is the system itself. There are actually some really sweet kids out there who work and want to do well, but are drowned out by all the craziness. Even some of the really out of control kids can be sweet if you get them alone, but it's impossible to manage a class with 35 to 40 kids and almost not even worth trying when you have an administration who not only doesn't support you, but can sometimes make things worse. A quick note on administration being bad. I had a class where I had asked a kid to move because his group table was being really loud and rambunctious. He refused and proceeded to tell me that I'm not moving. I called an admin, and when he got there and I told him what happened, he said no, he needs to stay in his original seat. That's where his regular teacher wants him. This undermined any authority I had. Thanks as whole. Another high school I taught at, when I first walked in, they handed me a sheet that told me I was under no circumstances to use the staff bathroom, under no circumstances to use the break room, and had to find off-campus parking. I asked where I was supposed to eat lunch. In the classroom. What? If there is another teacher using the classroom, this happens often. Find a place off campus or in your car. So basically the administration sucks on many levels. Anyway, worst job ever. I live in BC, Canada, and I'm currently going through the motions with our school system with my 8-year-old. There is absolutely no funding for special ed here anymore, and it's frustrating. On our end, my husband and I have hired a private tutor, and she attended Sylvan for 2 years. Waste of money, and we read with her and her 2 younger siblings. She is in grade 3 and doesn't seem much closer to being able to read. Her eyes and ears have been checked and ruled out. I recently went to a meeting with her school principal, her current teacher, school district child psychologist, and one of the 2 special ed teachers in her school. I was under the impression that at the end of the meeting we would have a plan for the future. This was not the case. They set up a special education plan, but she fell just short of qualifying to be labeled as learning disabled because of an assessment she took with a psychologist once. Also the one subject, 3 patterns, that she needs to duplicate under the original pictures, supposed to mean she can copy instructions, she scored highest in, was also the only one that she scored in the normal range, and she teacher said this score does not reflect how she works in class. As a child that went through the school system with special needs, you can probably tell from my stellar spelling, grammar and punctuation, I can tell you a lot has changed. I was in a special class from grades 1 to 5. My class was made for kids that were educable mentally handicapped. Needless to say, although they taught me everything I needed to know to get by in school, it set me back significantly socially. Also, in the class of 8, I was one only girl. Now I struggle to comprehend how they could go from one extreme to what they have now. I don't know how to be an advocate for my child. I keep in contact with her teacher, but they are already using all the resources they have available. The school district doesn't have any one-on-one time available, and I feel she is falling through the cracks. Her teachers tell me that she always tries hard and hasn't given up. She does at home. She seems discouraged that her brother, 4, and sister, 6, know their alphabet and numbers and can recognize them when written down, which is what she has difficulty doing, and her sister is starting to read. She's in kindergarten. I feel like I'm failing her as a parent. Do any of you have any tips for us? Edit. Forgot to write what the conclusion to the meeting with the teachers. I used to work at a junior college that gives underprivileged students a chance to train at a technical course, such as bartending, mechanics, cooking, etc. The college would take in all sorts. People who tried at real universities and failed, high school dropouts, teen moms, and in some cases, people on parole or guests of the local low security jail. So, I get this job, and the group I taught met at 9 p.m. to leave at 10:30. It was an electrician's training group, and they were all male, and about 22 out of the 30 guys were older than me. There was this one guy who, from day one, was very antagonistic towards me. He would loudly yawn as I explained things, post up pictures of women in bikinis and whine that it was unfortunate that all beaches couldn't look like that, and play music on his phone. After I asked him to either stop playing music or sit at a place in the room where there were no close-up neighbors that could be bothered, he told me to go fuck myself. And after that, he got more vicious. He would criticize my clothes. He would try to talk louder than me, or he would try to sabotage quizzes by going, "Oh, I know question 3. That's X, right?" He started following me around the hallways after class ended. Tell me he knew which car was mine. He kept saying how cool it was that the school didn't have metal detectors now. I'm 5 feet 2 inches, and I was 26 at the time. This guy was taller, older and heavier than me. I was scared to walk out of the building by myself. I had to tell the night guard to walk me to my car every night. I took the complaint to the academic director, and she tried to be very diplomatic about things, but I was being threatened and emotionally abused by this guy. I felt like the school only cared about the scholarship money they got from those students, and for the most part, I still feel that way. At any rate, I had to go over the academic director's head and go straight to the school's administrator. I basically told him he either had to get that man out of my classroom or find another teacher for that time period, because I couldn't tolerate him anymore. Then I broke down, and the guy got kicked out, not just out of my class, but out of the school itself, because all the other teachers had had problems with him as well. But it took me marching into the administrator and complaining to finally get the message through the academic director's head that no, this was not acceptable. And even then, I had no peace. The guy hung around the school's gates. The last thing he said to me was, "I know it was you who ratted me out. Then they say people are criminals when they kill beaches like you." Needless to say, I don't work in that place anymore. TLDR. Big crazy convict student holds a one-man psychological war with me. School couldn't be bothered because they wanted the scholarship money. Do not despair, the little woman won in the end. I'm starting off by saying I'm not a teacher. I'm a 9th grader, first year in high school, recently started 2nd semester. I've never been the best student, always tested well, but never turned in my homework. You teachers might know the kind, the ones that are so bright and have great potential, but they waste it. This thread has shown me what it's like being a teacher of bad students. I've always been annoyed by the really bad students, the ones always yelling, fighting, cursing, that sort of thing, but it was just personal annoyance. They were a nuisance in my day, and that's all I noticed or cared about. From now on, I'm going to shape up and do everything I can to help my teachers, especially in situations where the students are actively trying to ruin the teacher's day / happiness / career / life / livelihood. And as long as I'm here, I've got a story to share myself, told to me and some other students that were working on a test we hadn't finished that day after class. My physics teacher is probably the most fair teacher I've had so far. He'll often go against district policy for as long as he can when he knows the policy is unjust. He's told us that one year, 2 girls didn't finish a test by the end of the class. They asked if they could do it the next class, and he told them that they could do it at the end of class if they finished that day's work. However, a person from a college preparatory success plan foundation type thing came in to talk to the class, and they were left with no time to finish their test points despite the fact that it should been finished the first day. They went in to talk to the principal and complained that he didn't let them finish their test, even though he had no control over it. What they didn't know was that the principal at the time was a former student of my physics teacher. His response: "That man is the fairest person I have ever met in my life. Don't you ever complain about him to me again." Not necessarily a worst thing, but it does show that students going behind the teacher's back don't always win. I don't think this is nearly as bad as some of the stories in this thread point anyway. My mom is a math teacher at my high school. She's been teaching for 5 or 6 years now, I'd guess. But her first 2 years she had the worst classes. One semester, she had a particularly bad class. 8 of the kids in that class ended up in the alternative school the next semester. She wasn't as good of a teacher then as she is now, but she really cares about all of those students and always wants them to succeed. Anyway, these students would do anything to get attention and make them look cool with all their friends, and one of them is mad at my mom for some stupid reason. So he decides to put hand sanitizer in her coffee. Later that year someone does the same thing with Staples. All I can say is thank God someone told her before she drank it. I know a lot of these kids don't come from good situations at home, but it makes me so mad that they could have a teacher who genuinely loves all of her students and wants them to succeed even after all the crap they pull, and they would want to put her in the hospital. And then the worst part is how the administration acted. First of all, is it any wonder the majority of teachers who quit do it within their first 3 years, when they purposely give new teachers the worst classes? Then, after this happened, and my mom reported it, they refused to even do anything about it, because all the evidence they had was that this student saw them do it. My mom had to threaten to get the police involved before they cared enough to do something about students who find it entertaining to put someone in the hospital. Never been so pissed in my life. One of the most upsetting events was a young man had started swearing at me because he wanted to just walk out of class and I was blocking his way to go outside. I explained that if he did not wish to be in class, he could take a timeout, which was in another door opposite side of the room. They aren't locked or anything, just a place to cool down and separate yourself from the situation that is bothering you. He said, "Fuck you, you big asshole. I'm gonna mess your shit up." At my school we are trained in restraint. I was not after a physical altercation with this student. He simply needed to follow his plan of going to the timeout area when he was upset. Instead he decided he was going to push past me. I did not push back, but stood firm. Then he decided to tear my room apart. He threw desks, chairs, and flipped a table. Tried to knock over bookshelves. He picked up a clock and threw it across the room. All this time, the path to the timeout area was clear. We used minimal verbal interaction so as not to continue the argument, just to redirect and leave his path open. Then he ran at me and punched me in the face. I had my hands up but not in time to block the punch he threw. Back arrived at this point. There were 2 others besides me in the room. It took 5, minus myself, to escort him to the timeout area. After that was sure I never wanted to see a classroom again. The damage, the rage. I wanted to have no part of any of that. Who did this kid think he was? The mantra is to not take things personally, but that was a difficult day. The next day he was suspended and had to have work brought to his residential house. The next day walked in for the morning group and asked me for a piece of candy. This student is now in my homeroom. In fact, he asked to be there, which baffled me, but he hasn't torn the room apart. I go to a private school that has a reputation for being the top school in the state and full of caring, if heavily sheltered, well-behaved kids. When I was a freshman, I was taking Japanese. I heavily disliked the class because, for the life of me, I couldn't remember any of the complex characters to save my life. The one thing that got me through without quitting was this: all the Japanese teachers, all of them, are really caring people who actually care more about teaching morals than teaching Japanese, which they are pretty hard on, too. But anyway, there was this one kid I've had a frenemy-like relationship with since I arrived in 7th grade. At the time I abhorred him. He was the star football player, 5 feet 9 inches just about, lean, participated in community things, was very polite to girls, except me. Apparently, he got a kick out of pissing me off, and the biggest suck up, because he knew he could get away with pretty much anything. He was also taking Japanese, and every so often I'd hear horror stories about him because, well, let's face it, I'm closer to the teachers than I'm with most of my classmates. We'll call him Jard. So one afternoon, during my free period, I accompanied my friend, Dave, we'll say, to the computer labs. Upon arriving I noticed that the proctor was a substitute teacher who often subbed for out Japanese classes at every level. She noticed us. We were both in her class at some point and seemed overjoyed, but she was bothered by something. So Dave and I sat at a couple of computers right next to her and we chatted. I asked what was wrong, and she finally started just spilling beans with everything in them. Jard had been an absolute terror to her every time she had class with him. He's yell at her, give her those sweet talking persuasions that you just know stinks of douchebag, and overall raised a riot, and she couldn't, for the life of her, get him to stop. Dave and I both disliked him, so we were very sympathetic. The worst part was that she started to cry. I was genuinely horrified. I had never seen a teacher break down before, and it was made worse by the fact that everyone hated this guy, except the girls, but they suck up anyhow. But no one could do a thing. I later heard that he had thrown a paper ball, and it had hit another Japanese teacher. He was sent to the office, but emerged without penalty, somehow. After that, he seemed to have an affinity for throwing things. Never large heavy things that could kill someone or anything, but pens, pencils, paper, anything he could lift with a finger he'd chuck around. Despite knowing me and befriending me, the teachers couldn't do a damn thing. The look on my third year teacher's face was heartbreaking. She knew I was absolutely pissed, but in order to be fair, she couldn't move me away from him. We had seating charts. Granted, she made sure I was never in his immediate vicinity after that, but only after 2/4 of random draws has resulted in him being seated on my left every time. Jard was also in my geometry class that year. Our teacher was a scattery teacher. We'll call her Mrs. A, who, quite frankly, was not helpful at all. She had a squirt bottle she would use to subdue rowdy students. It worked for the first week, then the jock boys started enjoying it, Jard included. One morning we got our tests back. It wasn't a hard test, the class average was an 85%. However, Jard slams the desk, gets up, puts his arms out, and says, Mrs. A, what's up with this grade? Why are you giving me C4? It is worth noting that pidgin is common here, and it's cool for the jocks to speak it. He isn't a dumb kid, just stupid, knowing that responding would drag the day on longer. Mrs. A turns her back without word. Jard looks around the room by this time. Everyone is watching him, and he picks up a pen and flings it at Mrs. A. It hits a square in the back, and the entire class is suddenly deathly silent. She turns around and seems ready to bark at him, but Jard has his hands over his mouth saying, oh god, I didn't mean to, oh my god. And he's laughing as he's saying this. As predicted, Mrs. A does nothing. She just smiles and turns back around, while all the while my friend and I are quietly hissing at her to send him to the office. This is the same boy who harassed me for speech tics and for wearing jeans every day. How he passes and doesn't piss everyone off enough to get kicked is just beyond me. I once complained to a counselor and the counselor claimed it was my fault for telling Jard to shut up. Someone please fix the system. My class at secondary school. For 3 years I was stuck with the biggest assholes in the year. Me and my mates were the quietest in there, about 8 of 30. We had a student teacher from Canada for 3 months. He didn't last 3 weeks. Ginger bastard couldn't face the noise. Another French teacher done the same, stuck with us for 3 years. Then chose an extra 2 with us. She tried to stop the student leaving. He picked her up and moved her aside. What a cockand. Another teacher, they made her cry. Week before the end of the last year, she had us for at least 2 years. And she was pretty hot. Why get her to cry? Dem pubes. An Italian woman tried to teach us a lesson. Some students were getting her to point at the top word on the board. Every time she did, Bob Marley almost escaped from her pits. My granddad was a technician in a new school a few years back. He's seen some stuff. Smoking weed out the back, trying to pull out wires from the wall, shouting at teachers then calling them racist as soon as they said anything back. School of assholes. As for what I've seen teachers do to students, had one teacher get into an argument with a student over music. Amusing. A teacher leave the room, stood in a cupboard, on the phone for 30 plus minimums. Rumors. One teacher supposedly asked a student for sketch, then had to leave. Another supposedly hanged a student from his feet to empty his pockets. He was a legend though. Everyone loved him. Not like that pointo. And one student tried to tip a drink down a teacher's top before, but that I understood. Biggest tigs I ever did see. I've had a lot of terrible teachers, but I thought I'd rather mention a few great ones first. My Norwegian, our equivalent of your English class basically, teacher in the 3rd year of high school. I had him through all 3 years, and for the first 2 he was a hard ass, like you wouldn't believe. Most people hated him, me included, though I actually regret it now. He'd write people up for being 30 seconds late, if that gives you any idea. Then in the 3rd year, he was like a different guy. He knew that, while we only saw him 4 hours or so a week in the first 2 years, we would see him 10 hours a week in the 3rd. I'm pretty sure it was a strategy to make us cope with the vast increase in the 3rd year. Maybe it wasn't, but either way he is now a teacher I have a lot of respect for. I still remember in the 3rd year, when I had been missing an assignment for weeks. I was terrible with remembering to do things in high school, and I still am, but he still allowed me to turn it in, and he did graded simply because he didn't want to fail me if he didn't have to. When I turned it in he went to his office, came back and handed me a birthday card shaped like a sun, wearing sunglasses. On the back he had written better late than never. That brightened my day a bit. My second was a professor at the university I attended. I dropped out after year 1. Turns out game design can really break you when you're not prepared well enough. Anyway, he was our computer science professor. One day he was going to teach us how computers work by taking one apart, sending parts around the room, and so on during the lecture. He brought a laptop, a drill and a hammer. As most of us were half asleep he walked in, grabbed the laptop and bang, smashed it into the table, waking us up, and sending buttons flying. He then proceeded to smash the sheet out of this poor laptop, rip out the rubber thingy under the keyboard, and then said, "This is what the underside of your keyboard looks like." The rest of the lecture involved him destroying electronics with a hammer, then tossing all of it behind the speakers in the auditorium. Edit. Yeah, I'm not a teacher, just thought I'd share 2 stories about teachers I've liked. I have more, but the point is, as a former student I know there are great teachers out there, you just need to look for them. Student here. In middle school I went to a Catholic school. Class of about 6 to 8 kids. Teacher had a breakdown. No one knows why. She was promptly fired. Later I learned she was teaching in a public school nearby. This story I really enjoy. My senior year of high school I returned to my public high school after going to a special smart school at a college. I was taking Spanish to fill a requirement. I was the only senior among a bunch of juniors. I knew some of them from my time at the Catholic school. Within 2 weeks of class Mrs. S and I became friends. I was the oldest in the class and always the one to be quiet and be left alone. About a month in Mrs. S had to go do something and left the room right before the class began. A kid, let's call him Herpy, stood up and tried to call me gay. He purposefully called me out about this. I have been bullied many a time, and I was just going to let this go. Then his buddies, even a few females, piled on. So I proceed to talk to him. After 5 minutes of back and forth I get Herpy to admit to having sex with the animals on his farm. I didn't know if he had a farm, but he acted the farm hick. So the class is now laughing at him, and he is threatening to kick my ass. I invite him to try. As he begins to move towards me Mrs. S comes back in the door. Herpy sits back down quickly. Mrs. S looks at me and asks, "Tanith, did anything happen while I was gone?" Nope. Herpy was just explaining his love for animals. Class laughs. The rest of that year I walked head held high. Eventually went on to fight the admin of the district because I was told I could be arrested for assault for being bullied and defending myself. During that whole thing Mrs. S was really nice to me. I work as a temp secretary in a high school when they are running their summer school courses in July. Normally, I never get lip from even the worst kids. They know I'm just some guy doing his job, and they'd rather rip on their teachers or the principal. I add/drop students from a course, input attendance, record marks, and make sure paperwork is in order. Normally an uneventful job. One afternoon a student comes in wanting to use the office phone to call his dad. Nothing out of the ordinary, except this guy looks pissed. I hand him the phone, show him how to dial out, and get the sneaking suspicion that this guy's is going to start something. And he did, yeah, and then he took away my phone. This is bullshit. I pipe up, "Hey, language." Then I hear the most disrespectful insult I've ever heard thrown at me. Who Are you, guy, excuse me. I stand up, adrenaline pumping, knowing that I might get a punch thrown at me if he keeps this up. He tells his dad he'll call him back, slams the receiver down, and walks out of the office, muttering at me, touch me, and I'll slap you with 10 grand. Unfortunately, I lost it. Get the fuck back here. I walk after him, wanting to demand an apology. We get into a yelling match in the hallway. My principal, with the calmest look of indifference on his face, holding a fresh cup of coffee, walks over to our argument and diffuses it in the most professional way I've ever seen. Whoa, what's this all about? I keep my mouth shut, and the student very angrily explains that he was talking to his dad about a job interview at his company in the stairwell. The VP sees this and demands the phone from him. The VP explains to his dad that there's a zero tolerance policy in school regarding cell phones, and that the student can pick up his phone from the office at the end of the day. We have a zero tolerance policy on cell phones in school for good reasons, but I was calling my dad. They all say that. The other day, 4 students were using cell phones to coordinate with their boys in the neighborhood how they were going to jump a kid because he didn't give them copies of his homework. But I wasn't doing that. They all say that, but they all say that. Now, the VP was right. You can and will get your cell phone back at the end of the day when you come back to the main office. There are payphones in the lobby, and if you can't pay for those, or don't want to, you can come down to the main office and ask to use the phones in there. Okay, got it. The principal goes back into the office and the guy starts to make his way to the stairs. But I stop him once the principal is out of earshot. Before you go back to class, we need to settle this. Even though I'm a secretary, that doesn't mean I'm just a secretary. It doesn't give you the right to dump your sheet on me. And by the way, I have access to your attendance and enrollment in your class. I can take you out of our system snap like that, and you won't get that credit. Now, that would be a gross misuse of my position, and I won't do it, but don't tempt me. Got it? Yeah. Oklahoma sir. Got it. He was looking at the floor the entire time. I suppose as a student who got up to some mischief I should chirp up about some of the things I did. I had a teacher who consistently lost assignments, had a nasally voice, criticized people, basically the teacher that everybody hated. I was in a room full of jokers that messed with her occasionally. Considering her age and attitude, I figured the best prank was to tape record Bourne sounds and tape it under her desk. I made sure to leave some silence buffer room, so I had time to get back to my seat. She went to the back of the room, and in full view of everyone, except the teacher who had her back turned, I planted the device and started it. It went gloriously. She spent a full 5 minutes trying to find out where the sound was coming from. When she asked each student who did it, everyone claimed they were focused on their work and no one ratted me out. Another time I had a sub in one of my split lunch classes, where you go from class to lunch, and back to class to finish. Well, the sub got extremely agitated when he learned we normally brought back lunch to class to finish, and started yelling at us that we wouldn't be allowed to do that, and anyone that did so would be reported and face severe consequences. In addition, he did some aggressive pushing around with some of the students. So, when we went to lunch I bought $5 worth of fries and scattered them on the floor in our classroom. When the sub came back, he was late. All the students were assembled. He got livid. You could see the vein pulsing in his neck. He left immediately, thinking quickly. I got a few people to help me clean up the fries and put them into the trash can, covering them with papers. He came back with security, a janitor, and either the principal or vice principal, I forget. He stares at the clean floor and yells, "I swear it was here a second ago." The others just look at him, shake their heads, and leave. They still tell stories of me back in high school. I learned from my sister that I single-handedly forced them to redo their entire lateness policy and their attendance policy.